Hegel on self-consciousness, desire and death in the phenomenology of spirit. Robert B. Pippin. Hegel on self-consciousness. Introductory remarks. One of Hegel's main concerns in the revolutionary book he wrote in the German city of Jena while only in his 30s, his Phenomenology of Spirit, is a familiar modern philosophical concern, the attempt to understand the various competencies involved in distinctly human sentience, sapience, and agency, and, especially and above all in Hegel's project, the complex interrelations among all such competencies. So there are in his unprecedented book accounts of sensory receptivity, perception, judgment, generalization, inference, self-consciousness, gnomic necessity, justification, as well as of intention, purpose, practical reason, linguistic community, and sociality in general. Hegel's account is unusual in that it is conducted via a procedure he invented, a phenomenology, or what he at first called a science of the experience of consciousness. This new procedure, at the very minimum and somewhat crudely summarized, involved imagining possible models of experience, models of its basic structure, primarily experience of objects and of other subjects, restricted to one or some set of competencies, or in some specific relation, and then demonstrating by a series of essentially reductio ad absurdum arguments that such an imagined experience, when imagined from the point of view of the experiencer, really could not be a possible or coherent experience, thus requiring some determinate addition or alteration to repair the imagined picture, and so a new possibility to be entertained. Eventually such an internal testing of models of experience becomes in the course of Hegel's developmental account so detailed and rich that it amounts to an examination of the possibility and viability of an actual historical form of life, a historical experience conducted under the assumption of such competencies and their interrelationship. So once he has assembled all the materials necessary for a full, adequate picture of such a subject of experience, after the first 5 chapters, he then begins an even more unusual account of the development of such a subject, now a form of collective like-mindedness he calls Geist. From this point on, the account is even more unusual because Hegel treats the project of human self-knowledge as essentially a matter of what he calls Geist's actuality, its historical and social development, and he seems to effect a shift in the proper subject matter of philosophy itself, insisting that philosophy must not study mere concepts, but concepts in their actuality, and that means in the phenomenology in their historical actuality, when that actuality is considered in terms of this experiential test. So far, much of this should sound unusual but, aside from Hegel's highly idiosyncratic innovations in philosophical German, comprehensible and relatively trackable in the text. But there are 2 points in the progression of topics where puzzlement can easily become complete bafflement. They occur in the 4th chapter on self-consciousness, a passage Hegel himself points to as the most important in the book, its turning point. The first occurs when he suddenly claims, self-consciousness is desire itself, Begierde überhaupt. The second is just as, if not more important, for Hegel's theory of self-consciousness and for post-Hegelian thought, and it is just as difficult to understand, the claim that self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. I want to try to understand the meaning and philosophical motivation for these 2 claims in Hegel's adventurous book. Several qualifications are necessary, though, before embarking on such an enterprise. I will mention only the most serious, namely, that strictly speaking Hegel cannot be said to have a theory of self-consciousness in the usual sense, or at least that isolating such a theory does some violence to his famous holism. The entire phenomenology of spirit is a meditation on self-consciousness and the coming to self-consciousness of human subjects, especially as a kind of collective subject coming to collective self-consciousness, and Hegel treats as integral to this account everything from medieval Catholicism to the French Revolution. But as I hope to show in the following, the most distinctive, original aspect of that long account begins to come into focus in chapter 4, and that is sufficient reason for concentrating on that section alone. There is another, broader reason for doing so, one more specific to the British and American tradition of philosophy. For several reasons philosophers like Aristotle, Descartes, and Kant continue to have a living presence in contemporary Anglophone philosophy, at least to some degree, and, by contrast, what is rather clumsily characterized as European philosophy has very little presence at the elite research universities. 1 can make a good case that this supposedly divergent tradition began with Hegel and his influence on later European philosophy. There are two aspects to this influence. One has to do with the reluctance of those who philosophize under the shadow of Hegel to accept any firm separation between strictly epistemological or metaphysical issues or even broadly formal issues from various issues in what is traditionally considered practical philosophy, accounts of action, agency, purposiveness, interpretation, and the like. Such a holistic approach leads quickly to the second point of divergence, one that builds upon the integration of practical and theoretical philosophy, the post-Hegelian insistence on the relevance of human sociality and the historicity of that sociality in accounting for claims of cognitive success or even in understanding properly the nature of the basic mind-world and subject-subject relation inevitably presupposed in any account of the very possibility of epistemic or practical success. There are many forms of such claims for the philosophical relevance of such socio-historical actuality to what had traditionally been considered strictly philosophical issues in epistemology, metaphysics, moral theory, aesthetics, and so forth, socio-economic matters in Marxism, genealogy and psychology in Nietzsche, mood and resoluteness in Heidegger and existentialism, archaeology and genealogy in Foucault, the dependence of subject on structure, or the disappearance of subject into structure, in structuralism, and so forth. The countercharge by more traditional philosophy has always been, of course, that such enterprises transform philosophy into something else, and so massively transform philosophy as to lose touch with it altogether. What I am calling the divergence between the traditions could plausibly be said to have originated in the turning point of this individual chapter in the Phenomenology. Another reason for attending to it closely, even if in some violation of Hegel's holism. The book's turning point, in other words, involved a much broader turning point in the modern Western philosophical tradition, and so is especially valuable in the way it can highlight the issue, transformation of philosophy, or a farewell to philosophy altogether. And a strategy naturally suggests itself at this point. Since the topic of the chapter, self-consciousness, together with another to which it is deeply linked, freedom, are far and away the most important topics in what we call German idealism, I propose to begin with the introduction of the idea of the centrality of self-consciousness in human sapience by Immanuel Kant. For that is the position, I want to show, that Hegel is building on and transforming in the direction just suggested. Point 2. 1. Clumsily, because much of what is characterized as analytic philosophy originated in Austrian and German philosophy. 2. The following represents a reconsideration and substantial alteration of the interpretation of Chapter 4 I originally presented in Hegel's Idealism, The Satisfactions of Self-Consciousness, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1989, hereafter High. If anything, I am more committed here to what Scott Jenkins, in Hegel's Concept of Desire, Journal of the History of Philosophy 47, No. 1, 2009, pages 109-30, calls a contextualist approach, that is, working within the limitations of what has been developed in the first 3 chapters in order to explain why there seem to be so many new topics, rather than just helping oneself to an appeal to the capacities of rational, sentient beings in general, 109, as Jenkins does. I think the present account answers some of the concerns raised by Jenkins, 110-12. In general, Jenkins wants to press the point that Hegel should not be seen here as primarily concerned with a further elaboration of the conditions of knowing, which he sees me doing in High, but rather as advancing a broad, powerful claim about the nature of human subjectivity as such, that is his new theme. He goes on to deny that this subjectivity should be understood as a mere point of view, insisting instead that it is a corporeal, historical, laboring subject. It seems to me truer to the radically of Hegel's attempt to admit that he is indeed on about such themes, but in the service of a further elaboration of the possibility of intentional consciousness. Put another way, Jenkins does not seem to me to do justice, as McDowell does in an interpretation we shall look at shortly, to Hegel's formulation in 167 that in self-consciousness, the whole breadth of the sensuous world is preserved for it. It is true that there is a great deal to say about the content of a self-relation in relation to an object before the properly epistemological focus returns, but Hegel never loses sight of it. See also my concluding remarks about wholeness. Chapter 1. On Hegel's claim that self-consciousness is desire itself, Begierde überhaupt. Kant held that what distinguishes an object in our experience from the mere subjective play of representations is rule-governed unity. His famous definition of an object is just that in the concept of which a manifold is united, b. 137. This means that consciousness itself must be understood as a discriminating, unifying activity, paradigmatically as judging, and not as the passive recorder of sensory impressions. Such a claim opens up a vast territory of possibilities and questions, since Kant does not mean that our awake attentiveness is to be understood as something we intentionally do, in the standard sense, even if it is not also a mere event that happens to us, as if we happen to be triggered into a determinate mental state, or as if sensory stimuli just activate an active mental machinery. Kant also clearly does not mean to suggest by his claim that the form of consciousness is a judgmental form that consciousness consists of thousands of very rapid judgmental claims being deliberately made, thousands of S's, P's, or if a then B's taking place. The world is taken to be such and such without such takings being isolatable, intentional judgments. What Kant does mean by understanding consciousness as synthetic is quite a formidable, independent topic in itself. Point 1. Kant's main interest in the argument of the deduction was to show first that the rules governing such activities, whatever the right way to describe such activities, cannot be wholly empirical rules, all derived from experience, that there must be rules for the derivation of such rules that cannot themselves be derived, or that there must be pure concepts of the understanding, and second, that these non-derived rules have genuine objective validity, are not mere subjective impositions on an independently received manifold, that, as he puts it, the a priori prescribed synthetic unity of consciousness is not merely a condition that I myself require in knowing an object, but is a condition under which any intuition must stand in order to become an object for me, b. 138. Kant seems to realize that he gives the impression that for him consciousness is a two-step process, the mere reception of sensory data, and then the conceptualization of such data, but he works hard in the pursuit of the second desideratum to disabuse his readers of that impression. Aside from some Kant scholars, there are not many philosophers who still believe that Kant proved in this argument that we possess synthetic a priori knowledge, although there is wide admiration for the power of Kant's arguments about, at least, causality and substance. But there remains a great deal of interest in his basic picture of the nature of conscious-mindedness. For the central component of his account, judgment, is, as already noted, not a mental event that merely happens, as if causally triggered into its synthetic activity by sensory stimuli. Judging, while not a practical action initiated by a decision, is nevertheless an activity sustained and resolved, sometimes in conditions of uncertainty, by a subject, and that means that it is normatively structured. The categorical rules of judgment governing such activity are rules about what ought to be judged, how our experience ought to be, must be, organized. For example, we distinguish or judge successive perceptions of a stable object as really simultaneous in time, and not actually representing something successive. This is a distinction that we must make. We experience successiveness in both cases and must be able to determine what ought to be judged simultaneous and what actually successive. Point 2. So such rules are not rules describing how we do operate, are not psychological laws of thought, but involve a responsiveness to normative proprieties. And, to come to the point of contact with Hegel that is the subject of the following, this all means that consciousness must be inherently reflective or apperceptive. I cannot be sustaining an activity, implicitly trying to get, say, the objective temporal order right in making up my mind, without in some sense knowing I am so taking the world to be such, or without apperceptively taking it so. I am taking or construing rather than merely recording, because I am also in such taking holding open the possibility that I may be taking falsely. So all consciousness is inherently, though rarely explicitly, self-conscious. It is incorrect to think of a conscious state as just filled with the rich details of a house perception, as if consciousness merely registers its presence. I take or judge the presence of a house, not a barn or gas station, or in Kant's famous formula, that I think must be able to accompany all my representations. But what could be meant by inherently, or in some sense knowing I am taking or judging it to be such and such? In what sense am I in a relation to myself in any conscious relation to an object? That is, the claim is that all consciousness involves a kind of self-consciousness, taking S to be P and thus taking myself to be taking S to be P. But in a self-relation like this, the self in question cannot be just another object of intentional awareness. If it were, then there would obviously be a regress problem. By parity of whatever reasoning established that the self must be able to observe itself as an object in taking anything to be anything, one would have to also argue that the observing self must also be observable, and so on. The self-relation, whatever it is, cannot be a two-place intentional relation, and the self-consciousness of consciousness cannot invite a two-stage or two-element picture, our conscious sentience and then, in addition, our self-monitoring self-relation. As Kant and Hegel would put it, the latter is just consciousness again, and we have not found self-consciousness. 3. Hegel's own most famous discussion of these issues is found in the first 4 chapters of his 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit, hereafter Ph.G. The first 3 chapters of that book are grouped together under the heading Consciousness, and the 4th chapter is called simply Self-Consciousness. That 4th chapter has only one subsection, called The Truth of Self-Certainty, and that will be the focus of the following discussion, for accordingly, especially given the extraordinarily sweeping claims Hegel makes about his indebtedness to the Kantian doctrine of apperception 5, one would expect that these sections have something to do with the Kantian points noted earlier, and so with the issue of the self-conscious character of experience and the conditions for the possibility of experience so understood. But there has been a lot of understandable controversy about the relation between the first 3 chapters of the Ph.G. and the 4th. Since the 4th chapter discusses desire, life, a struggle to the death for recognition between opposed subjects, and a resulting Lord Bondsman social structure, it has not been easy to see how the discussion of sense certainty, perception, and the understanding is being continued. Some very influential commentators, like Alexander Kojève, pay almost no attention to the first 3 chapters. They write as if we should isolate the self-consciousness chapter as a freestanding philosophical anthropology, a theory of the inherently violent and class-riven nature of human sociality. There are never simply human beings as such in Kojève's account. Our species' status as one and all equal free subjects must be collectively achieved, and until the final bloody revolution ushers in a classless society, there are only masters and slaves. Others argue that in Chapter 4, Hegel simply changes the subject to the problem of sociality. We can see why it might be natural for him to change the subject at this point, for it is a different subject. Having introduced the necessary role of self-consciousness in consciousness, Hegel understandably changes the topic to very broad and different and independent questions like, what, in general, is self-consciousness? What is a self? What is it to be a being for which things can be, to use Brandam's language, who offers his own version of the change of subject interpretation? 6. More recently, some commentators, like John McDowell and Perminster Keeler-Whitehofer, have argued that there is actually neither a new beginning nor a shift in topics in Chapter 4. In McDowell's treatment, the problem is an extension and development of the one that emerged in the first 3 chapters but still basically concerns that issue, how to understand the right equipoise between independence and dependence in the relations between subjects and objects. What appear to be the orectic 7 and social issues of Chapter 4 are for McDowell figures or analogies for what remains the problem of the mind's passive dependence on objects and active independence of them in our experience of the world, in just the sense sketched previously in the summary of Kant, i.e., neither independent subjective imposition, nor merely passive receptive dependence. What we have is a picture of our active, spontaneous self in a kind of mythic confrontation and struggle with its own passive empirical self, struggling at first futilely, for radical independence, and then an initial but doomed relation of dominance, as if the soul tries to make of its own corporeal nature a knecht or mere servant. Point 8. So for McDowell, Hegel does not mean to introduce in a direct sense the topic of desire as a necessary element in the understanding of consciousness itself, as the text, however counterintuitively, would seem to imply. Rather, says McDowell, desire überhaupt functions as a figure for the general idea of negating otherness, admittedly an orectic issue of some sort, by appropriating or consuming, incorporating into oneself what at first figures as merely other, something that happens in perception, say 9 and life. The next topic in the chapter, is said to exemplify the structure of der Begriff, let us say, the basic logical structure of all possible intelligibility, all sense-making. Point 10. The struggle to the death for recognition is said to be a rich and colorful allegory of the possible relations of both independent and dependent sides within one consciousness. And so McDowell asserts that Chapter 4 does not yet directly introduce the issue of sociality at all, despite the famous phrase there about the new presence of an I that is a we and a we that is an I. This interpretation has the very great virtue of preserving a connection with the first 3 chapters, but, as I will argue, while the general issue of the logic of the relation between independence and dependence is certainly applicable to the relation between spontaneous apperception and the passive empirical self, McDowell's interpretation, however rich in itself, fails to do justice to the radically of what Hegel actually proposes. I want to argue that when Hegel says that self-consciousness is desire überhaupt 11, he means that to be relevant to the question of the apperceptive nature of consciousness itself, and that thereby he provides the basis for the claim that self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. Point 12. Defending that interpretation is the task of this book. So here stated all at once is the thesis I would like to attribute to Hegel. That is, the thesis worked out and defended in Chapter 4. As noted, the entire book is a meditation on self-consciousness, on the becoming self-consciousness of Geist. I think that Hegel's position is that we misunderstand all dimensions of self-consciousness, from apperception in consciousness itself, to simple, explicit reflection about myself, to practical self-knowledge of my own so-called identity, by considering any form of it as in any way observational or inferential or immediate or any sort of two-place intentional relation. However we come to know anything about ourselves, or whatever self-relation is implicit in attending to the world, it is not by observing an object, nor by conceptualizing an inner intuition, nor by any immediate self-certainty or direct presence of the self to itself. From the minimal sense of being aware of being determinately conscious at all, of judging, to complex avowals of who I am, of my own identity and deep commitments, Hegel, I want to say, treats self-consciousness as, a practical achievement of some sort. Point 13. Such a relation must be understood as the result of an attempt, never, as it certainly seems to be, as an immediate presence of the self to itself, and it often requires some sort of striving, even struggle, and all of this even in accounting for the self-conscious dimension of ordinary perceptual experience. Self-consciousness, in all its forms, is some mode of mindedness that we must achieve, be continually achieving, and that must mean, can ultimately fail to achieve fully, and once having achieved can lose. It is nothing like turning the mind's eye inward to inspect itself. Point 14. Admittedly, it seems very hard to understand why anyone would think that my awareness, say, not just of the contents of a lecture I am giving, but whatever kind of awareness I have of my being in the process of giving a lecture, of actually following appropriate lecturing rules, should involve any such practical activity or achievement. It seems effortless to be so self-aware, there is no felt desire or striving or struggle involved, and as a report of what seems to me to be the case, it even appears incorrigible. But Hegel wants to claim that as soon as we properly see the error of holding that the self in any self-awareness is immediately present to an inspecting mind, or that it is a higher level mode of self-monitoring, his own interpretation is just thereby implied. If the self's relation to itself cannot be immediate or direct or of an object, but if some self-relation is a condition of intentional awareness, the conclusion that it is some sort of to be achieved follows for him straightforwardly. 15 Even a minimal form of self-conscious taking to be so opens up the possibility of taking falsely or in a way inconsistent with other, or all, such takings, and so sets a certain sort of task. More on this in a minute. This is the central motive for his version of the claim that consciousness is apperceptive. 16. Another way of putting this point, one that ties in with almost every aspect of Hegel's philosophical approach, would be to note that if self-consciousness or any form of taking oneself to be or being committed to anything is not introspective or observational, then it must always be provisional. Such a self-regard requires some confirmation or realization out in the world and for others if it is to count as what it is taken to be. The clearest examples of this occur in Hegel's theory of agency, where one cannot be said to actually have had the intention or commitment one avows, even sincerely avows, until one actually realizes that intention and the action turns out to count as that action in the social world within which it is enacted. And of course, people can come to find out that their actual intentions, as manifested in what they actually are willing to do, can be very different from those they avow, even sincerely avow. 17. And, 18 Hegel sees such an attempt and achievement as necessarily involving a relation to other people, as inherently social. This last issue about the role of actualization begins to introduce such a dependence, but it is hard to see at the outset why other people need be involved in the intimacy and privacy that seems to characterize my relation to myself. His case for looking at things this way has three main parts. In a way that is typical of his procedure, he tries to begin with the most theoretically thin or simple form of the required self-relation, and so first considers the mere sentiment of self that a living being has in keeping itself alive, where keeping itself alive reflects this minimal reflective attentiveness to self. Such a minimal form of self-relatedness is shown not to establish the sort of self-relatedness, normative self-determination, required as the desideratum in the first 3 chapters. He then asks what alters when the object of the desires relevant to maintaining life turns out not to be just another object or obstacle but another subject. In effect, he argues that everything changes when our desires are not just thwarted or impeded, but challenged and refused. And he then explores how the presence of such an other subject, in altering what could be a possible self-relation, sets a new agenda for the rest of the phenomenology, for the problems of both sapience and agency. 2. The central passage where the putative practical turn in all this takes place is the following. But this opposition between its self-consciousness's appearance and its truth has only the truth for its essence, namely, the unity of self-consciousness with itself. This unity must become essential to self-consciousness, which is to say, self-consciousness is desire itself. 167, Begierde überhaupt, which could also be translated as desire in general, or desire, generally, or mere desire. I am following here Terry Pinker's translation. 19. The passage presupposes the larger issue we have been setting out, the way Hegel has come to discuss the double nature of consciousness, consciousness of an object, a this such, and the non-positional consciousness or implicit awareness of my taking it to be this such. 20 He discusses this as what he calls an opposition, or, as he says, the negativity that this doubleness introduces within consciousness, the fact that consciousness is not simply absorbed into, identified with, its contents, but has also, let us say, taken up a position toward what it thinks. 21 To understand this, we need the following passage from the introduction. However, consciousness is for itself its concept, and as a result it immediately goes beyond the restriction, and, since this restriction belongs to itself, it goes beyond itself too. 80. 22. He is actually making two claims here. The first is the premise of his inference, that consciousness is for itself its concept. The idea seems to be, if we understand this first premise properly, we will understand why he feels entitled to the and as a result, the claim that consciousness is thereby immediately beyond any such restriction or concept that it sets for itself. I want to claim that this all amounts to a defense of the claim that consciousness must be understood as apperceptive. He means to say that the normative standards and proprieties at play in human consciousness are consciousness's own, that is, are followed by a subject, are not psychological, empirical laws of thought, to return to the point made earlier. This is his version of the Kantian principle that persons are subject to no law or norm other than ones they have subjected themselves to. Point 23, this is what is packed into the for itself here. This does not mean either in Kant or in Hegel that there are episodes of self-subjection or explicit acts of allegiance or anything as ridiculous as all that, just that norms governing what we think and do can be said to govern thought and action only insofar as subjects, however implicitly or habitually or unreflectively, or as a matter of second nature, accept such constraints and sustain allegiance, they follow the rules, are not governed by them. It is only because of this that someone like Socrates or Galileo or Freud can occasion intellectual crises. As all the post-Wittgensteinian discussion of rule following has shown, there cannot be any rules for the following of these rules, so one can be said to be following such rules in carrying out what is required without any explicit calculation of how to do so. How the allegiance gets instituted and how it can lose its grip are matters Hegel is very interested in, but it has nothing to do with individuals deciding about allegiances at moments of time. Or, to invoke Kant again, knowers and doers are not explicable as being subject to laws of nature, although as also ordinary objects, they are so subject, but by appeal to their representation of laws and self-subjection to them. Point 24. And Hegel means this to apply in ordinary cases of perceptual knowledge too. I know what would count as good perceptual reasons for an empirical claim on the basis of whatever shape of spirit or possible model of experience is under consideration at whatever stage in the PhD. That is, Hegel considers empirical rules of discrimination, unification, essence/appearance distinctions, conceptions of explanation, etc., as normative principles, and he construes some set of these as a possible determinate whole, as all being simply manifestations of the overriding requirements of a shape of spirit considered in this idealized isolation of capacities that makes up chapters 1 through 5, and he cites possible illustrations of such a shape and such internal contradictions, determinate illustrative actual cases like trying to say this here now, or trying to distinguish the thing which bears properties from those properties. The concepts involved in organizing perceptual experience are also norms prescribing how the elements of perceptual experience ought to be organized, especially in Kant temporally organized, and so they do not function like fixed physiological dispositions. We are responsive to a perceivable environment in normative ways. Another way to put this would be to say that our discriminated attentiveness never occurs episodically, but as part of a totality or whole within which any such discrimination must fit, and so any such attentiveness is subject to a certain sort of strain when it threatens not to fit. That totality is a norm, not a law of thought. On a certain, empiricist, way of thinking, it can seem very odd to say that such a totality and its proprieties can be in any sense held in mind, that one is attentive in the light of such a totality and its requirements, without that totality being another idea or representation one attends to. But that would be most paradoxical. Such an idea would just be another one in and subject to the requirements of such a totality, and we would be no better and much worse off postulating it. This issue is of a piece with the same deeply misleading temptation to think that any achievement language, like that introduced earlier, must refer to a separate enterprise I set out to accomplish after I realize something about a claim or practical project. Finally, and this is the most important indication of their normative status, since the principles involved guide my behavior or conclusions only insofar as they are accepted and followed, they can prove themselves inadequate, and lose their grip. This is what Hegel means in the conclusion of his inference by saying that consciousness immediately goes beyond this restriction. It is always beyond any norm in the sense that it is not, let us say, stuck with such a restriction as a matter of psychological fact. Consciousness is always in a position to alter norms for correct perception, inferring, lawmaking, or right action. Perception of course involves physiological processes that are species identical across centuries and cultures, but perceptual knowledge also involves norms for attentiveness, discrimination, unification, exclusion, and conceptual organization that do not function like physiological laws. And so, as Hegel says, as a result, we should be said to stand always by them and yet also beyond them. This can all still seem to introduce far too much normative variability into a process, perception, that seems all much more a matter of physiological fact. But while Hegel certainly accepts that the physiological components of perception are distinguishable from the norm-following or interpretive elements, he also insists that the physiological and the normative aspects are inseparable in perception itself. As in Heidegger's phenomenology, there are not two stages to perception, as if a perception of a white rectangular solid is then interpreted as a refrigerator. What we see is a refrigerator. The second dimension of this claim from AD concerns how such consciousness is beyond itself in another way. Besides the claim that consciousness, as he says, negates what it is presented with, that it does not merely take in but determines what is the case, the claim is also that ordinary, everyday consciousness is always going beyond itself, never wholly absorbed in what it is attending to, never simply or only in a perceptual state, but always resolving its own conceptual activity, and this in a way that means it can be said both to be self-affirming, possibly issuing in judgments and imperatives, but also potentially self-negating, aware that what it resolves or takes to be the case might not be the case. It somehow stands above what it also affirms, to use an image that Hegel sometimes invokes, although he again means, stands above in so resolving, not in addition to. It adds to the interpretive problems to cite below the canonical formulation of this point, but it might help us see how important it is for his whole position and why he is using language like negativity for consciousness itself. Such terminology is the key explicans for his eventual claim that self-conscious consciousness is desire. This formulation in Hegeli's is from the phenomenology section of the last version of his encyclopedia, the Berlin Phenomenology again. The I is now this subjectivity, this infinite relation to itself, but therein, namely in this subjectivity, lies its negative relation to itself, diremption, differentiation, judgment. The I judges, and this constitutes it as consciousness, it repels itself from itself. This is a logical determination. Point 25. So the large question to which Hegel thinks we have been brought by his account of consciousness in the first 3 chapters is, just what is it for a being to be not just a recorder of the world's impact on one's senses, but to be for itself in its engagements with objects? What is it in general for a being to be for itself to be at issue for it in its relation with what is not it? This is the problem that arose with the Kantian revelation in the understanding chapter of the PhD that, in trying to get to the real nature of the essence of appearances, understanding experiences only itself, which, he says, raises the problem, the cognition of what consciousness knows in knowing itself requires a still more complex movement. 167, my emphasis. This is the fundamental issue being explored in chapter 4. That the basic structure of the Kantian account is preserved until this point is clear from the following. With that first moment, self-consciousness exists as consciousness, and the whole breadth of the sensuous world is preserved for it, but at the same time only as related to the second moment, the unity of self-consciousness with itself. 167, 26. This passage and indeed all of 167 indicate that Hegel does have in mind a response to the problem of a self-conscious consciousness, of the whole breadth of the sensible world, developed in the first 3 chapters. What is the relation to itself inherent in any possible relation to objects, and that he insists on a common sense acknowledgement that whatever account we give of a self-determining self-consciousness, it is not a wholly autonomous or independent self-relating, the sensuous world must be preserved. But it is at this point that he then suddenly makes a much more controversial, pretty much unprepared for, and not at all recognizably Kantian, claim. But this opposition between its appearance and its truth has only the truth for its essence, namely, the unity of self-consciousness with itself. This unity must become essential to self-consciousness, which is to say, self-consciousness is desire itself. 167. Hegel is talking about an opposition between appearance and truth here because he has, in his own words, just summarized the issue of consciousness's negative relation to the world and itself this way. Otherness thereby exists for it as a being, that is, as a distinguished moment, but, for it, it is also the unity of itself with this distinction as a second distinguished moment. 167. That is, consciousness may be said to affirm implicitly a construal of some intentional content, but since it has thereby, by its own taking, negated any putative immediate certainty, since it is also always beyond itself, its eventual unity with itself, its satisfaction that what it takes to be the case is the case and can be integrated with everything else it takes to be the case, requires the achievement of a unity with itself, not any immediate certainty or self-regard. This is his echo of the Kantian point that the unity of apperception must be achieved, contents must be, as Kant says, brought to the unity of apperception. But still, at this point, the gloss he gives on the claim that self-consciousness is desire is not much help. The gloss is, as if an appositive, this the unity of self-consciousness with itself must become essential to self-consciousness, which is to say, etc. The first hint of a practical turn emerges just here when Hegel implies that we need to understand self-consciousness as a unity to be achieved, that there is some opposition between self-consciousness and itself, a kind of self-estrangement, which, he seems to be suggesting, we are moved to overcome. The unity of self-consciousness with itself muss ihm wesentlich werden, must become essential to the experiencing subject, a practical turn of phrase that in effect almost unnoticed serves as the pivot around which the discussion turns suddenly and deeply practical. As we shall see, this unity eventually does much more clearly become essential as a result of a putative encounter with another and opposing self-conscious being. And it is clearly practical in the everyday sense in which we might say to someone, "You're wasting chances for advancement, your career must become essential to you." There would be no problem here, or not as much of one, if Hegel had just noted that human desire is self-conscious desire, something he also of course holds. That would be to make the point that self-conscious desirers do not desire in episodic and isolated moments of desire, they desire in the light of the other things they desire, for one thing, and that alone is a way of saying that the desire itself is self-conscious, and not that human desires are like animal desires but then can be also self-monitored. But Hegel's speculative reverse predication is what requires a deeper interpretation. Since the self-conscious aspect of ordinary empirical consciousness is much more like a self-determination, or one could say a resolve or a committing oneself, what Fichte called a self-positing, than a simple self-observation or direct awareness, Hegel begins again to discuss consciousness as a negation of the world's independence and otherness. He means to say, we are, just in actively attending to the world, overcoming the indeterminacy, opacity, foreignness, potential confusion, and disconnectedness of what we are presented with by resolving what belongs together with what, tracking objects through changes and so forth. 27 Hegel then makes another unexpected move when he suggests that we consider the most uncomplicated and straightforward experience of just this striving or orectic for itselfness, what he calls life. By way of this reflective turn into itself, the object has become life. What self-consciousness distinguishes from itself as existing also has in it, insofar as it is posited as existing, not merely the modes of sense certainty and perception. It is being which is reflected into itself, and the object of immediate desire is something living. 168. This is the most basic experience 28 of what it is to be at issue for oneself as one engages the world. As Hegel says, we begin with what we know we now need, a being reflected into itself, and our question, how should we properly describe the self of the self-relation necessary for conscious intentionality and ultimately agency, is given the broadest possible referent, its own mere life. We have something like a sentiment of self as living and, as we shall see, as also needing to be achieved, requiring that the living being act purposively in order to live. Other objects too are not now merely external existence, not merely the modes of sense certainty and perception, although they are also that, but, in order to move beyond the empty formality of I am the I who is thinking these thoughts, they are now also considered as objects for the living subject, as threats to, means to, or indifferent to such life-sustaining. This brute or simple for itself quality of living consciousness, which form of self-relation we share with animals, will not remain the focus of Hegel's interest for long, but, if it is becoming plausible that Hegel is indeed trying to extend the issue raised in the consciousness section, and neither changing the subject, nor repeating the problem and desideratum in a figurative way, it already indicates what was just suggested, that he is moving quickly away from Kant's transcendental formal account of the apperceptive nature of consciousness. The I is for itself in consciousness for Kant only in the sense that the I, whoever or whatever it is, must be able to accompany all my representations. The world is experienced as categorically ordered because I in some sense order it, I think it as such, and that activity is not merely triggered into operation by the sense contents of experience. I undertake it, but I do so only in the broad formal sense of temporally unifying, having a take on, the contents of consciousness, bringing everything under the unity of a formally conceived apperceptive I. This simply means that every content must be such that one continuous I can think it. The I is just the unity effected. The subject's relation to objects is a self-relation only in this sense, and Hegel has introduced what seems like a different and at first arbitrary shift in topics to my sustaining my own life as the basic or first or most primary model of this self-relation, not merely sustaining the distinction between, say, successions of representations and a representation of succession. Now the whole section on life, essentially 168 to 174, is among the most opaque of any passages in Hegel, which is saying something. I should note that what I need here is Hegel's basic framework, in which he starts with the claim that with our reflective turn, durch dies Reflexion in sich selbst, consciousness is related to life. Self-relation as mere sentiment of oneself as living and as having to maintain life does not, however, establish my taking up and leading my determinate life as an individual. I am just an exemplar of the species requirements of my species, playing them out within the infinite totality of life itself as genus. Just by living I am nothing but a moment in the universal process of life, a kind of Schellingian universal, and Schelling talked this way about life. But throughout, the framework is, the first object of self-consciousness is life. That is, Hegel does not suddenly decide to talk about life, just qua life. As he says several times, he wants to understand life as the immediate object of desire, itself the most immediate form of self-relation, a sentiment of self that opens a gap, something negative to be filled, requiring the negation of barriers to life and the negation of stasis, in the face of the need to lead a life. That is, I take a main point to be that introduced in 168, in this self-relation, there is an estrangement, Anziehung, between self-consciousness and life, as he says. All through the phenomenology of life as the infinite universal substance as the object of desire, the problem Hegel keeps pointing to is how, under what conditions, the self-relating can be said to become a relating to self that is a relation to me, a distinction within the universal genus, life. I seem rather just to be subject to the imperatives or demands of life for my species. Rather than being the subject of my desires, I am subject to my desires. The first 3 chapters have already established the need to understand some sort of normative autonomy, and this first actuality of self-relatedness, life, and leading a life, conflicts with this requirement unless such a subject can establish its independence from life. What is important to my account here is the course of this becoming determinate account until it begins to break into its conclusion, toward the end of 172, until this estrangement of the undifferentiated fluidity is the very positing of individuality, dies entziehen der Unterschiedlosen Flüssigkeit ist eben das Setzen der Individualität. Such a self-determined individual must be established, and that especially requires a different, non-natural relation with another subject who must realize the same self-relatedness. This will be the subject of Chapter 2. What Hegel struggles to say after this is why, without the intermediation by the outer, that is, without a self-relation in relation to another self, this all fails, a typically Hegelian coming acropper. Point 29. This shift to the topic of life is also not arbitrary, because Hegel has objected, and will continue to object throughout his career, to any view of the I in I think as such a merely formal indicator of the I or he or it, in Kant's phrase, which thinks. In Hegel's contrasting view, while we can certainly make a general point about the necessity for unity in experience by abstracting from any determination of such a subject and go on to explore the conditions of such unity, we will not get very far in specifying such conditions without, let us say, more determination already in the notion of the subject of experience. This criticism is tied to what was by far the most widespread dissatisfaction with Kant's first critique, which Hegel shared, and which remains today one of its greatest weaknesses, the arbitrariness of Kant's table of categories. The fact that he has no way of deducing from the I think must be able to accompany all my representations what the I must necessarily think, what forms it must employ, in thinking its representations. The emptiness of Kant's I is directly linked for Hegel to the ungroundedness and arbitrariness of his table of categories. Point 30. However, understanding this charge would take us deep into Hegel's criticisms of Kantian formality. What we need now is a clearer sense of what Hegel is proposing, not so much what he is rejecting. Let me first complete a brief summary of the themes in Chapter 4, once we begin reading it this way, and then see where we are. 3. As we have seen, if a self-conscious consciousness is to be understood as striving in some way, then the most immediate embodiment of such a striving would be a self's attention to itself as a living being. 31 That is how it is immediately for itself in relation to other objects. Living beings, like animals, do not exist in the way non-living beings, like rocks or telephones, merely exist. They must strive to stay alive, and so we have our first example of the desideratum, a self-relation in relation to objects. Life must be led, sustained, and this gap between my present life and what I must do to sustain it in the future is what is meant by calling consciousness desire as lack or gap, and so a negation of objects as impediments or mere things. 32 If consciousness and desire can be linked as closely as Hegel wants to, that is, identified, then consciousness is not an isolatable registering and responding capacity of the living being that is conscious. And if this all can be established, then we will at this step have moved far away from considering a self-conscious consciousness as a kind of self-aware spectator of the passing show and moved closer to considering it as an engaged, practical being, whose practical satisfaction of desire is essential to understanding the way the world originally makes sense to it, the way it makes sense of the world, or is intelligible at all. Hegel's claim is that consciousness is desire, not merely that it is accompanied by desire. Obviously this claim has some deep similarities with the way Heidegger insists that Dasein's unique mode of being in the world is Sorge, or care, and with Heidegger's constant insistence that this has nothing to do with the subject projecting its pragmatic concerns onto a putatively neutral, directly apprehended content. At points Hegel tries to move away from very general and abstract points about living beings and desire and to specify the distinctive character of desire that counts as self-consciousness, as was claimed in his identification. He wants, that is, to distinguish actions that are merely the natural expression of desire, and a being that is merely subject to its desires, and a corresponding form of self-consciousness that is a mere sentiment of self, from actions undertaken in order to satisfy a desire, the actions of a being that does not just embody its self-sentiment but can be said to act on such a self-conception. He wants to distinguish natural or animal desire from human desire, and so tries to distinguish a cycle of desires and satisfactions that continually arise and subside in animals from beings for whom their desires can be objects of attention, issues at stake, ultimately reasons to be acted on or not. This occurs in a very rapid series of transitions in 175, where Hegel starts distinguishing the cycle of the urges and satisfactions of mere desire from a satisfaction that can confirm the genuinely self-relating quality of consciousness, rather than its mere self-sentiment. 33. That is, we have already seen a crucial aspect of the structure of Hegel's account, that any self-relating is always also in a way provisional and a projecting outward, beyond the near immediacy of any mere self-taking. Conscious takings of any sort are defeasible, held open as possibilities, and so must be tested, and avowed commitments must be realized in action for there to be any realization of the avowed intention, and so revelation of what the subject was in fact committed to doing. The projected self-sentiment of a merely living self is realized by the negation of the object of desire necessary for life, part of an endless cycle of being subject to one's desires and satisfying them. This all begins to change at the end of the paragraph, 175, as Hegel contemplates a distinct kind of object which in a sense negates back, and not merely in the manner of a prey that resists a predator, but which can also, as he says, effect this negation in itself, or, come to be in the self-relation required by our desiring self-consciousness. That is, Hegel introduces into the conditions of the satisfaction of any self-relating another self-consciousness, an object that cannot merely be destroyed or negated in the furtherance of life without the original self-consciousness losing its confirming or satisfying moment. He then identifies a further condition for this distinction that is perhaps the most famous claim in the phenomenology. It is this one. Self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness, 175. He specifies this in an equally famous passage from 178. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself because and by way of its existing in and for itself for another, i.e., it exists only as recognized. As we shall see in more detail in the analysis of this claim in the next chapter, Hegel wants to introduce a complication into any account of the self-relation he is trying to show is constitutive for intentional consciousness and purposive deeds. As we have seen, consciousness is said to be beyond itself because its self-relating self-determining is always defeasible, or challengeable in the case of action, and so its being in its very self-relation in some way held open to such a possibility is considered a constitutive condition. In the broadest sense, this means that such takings and doings are supported by reasons, even if mostly in deeply implicit and rarely challenged ways. Conscious takings can always rise to the level of explicit judgments and defenses of judgments. Habitual actions can be defended if necessary. Hegel now introduces the possibility unavoidable given the way he has set things up that all such considerations are uniquely open to challenge by other conscious, acting beings. Such challenges could initially be considered as merely more natural obstacles in the way of desire satisfaction in all the various forms now at issue in Hegel's account. But by considering imaginatively the possibility of a challenge that forces the issue to the extreme, where attachment to life and mere subjection to desire can be said to become an option, a struggle to the death, Hegel tries to show how the unique nature of such a challenge from another like-minded being forces the issue of the normative, or not just naturally explicable, character of one's takings and practical commitments, and any possible response, to the forefront. To be norm-sensitive at all is then shown not just to be open to these unique sorts of challenges, but to be finally dependent on some resolution of them. It is on the basis of this account, how we can be shown to open ourselves to such challenges and such dependence just as a result of a phenomenological consideration of the implications of the apperception thesis, that Hegel begins his attempt to establish one of the most ambitious claims of the phenomenology of spirit, the sociality of consciousness and action. 4. Before concluding this chapter, let me pause here to consider both the objections John McDowell has made to this sort of reading and his alternative interpretation. He says that in the crucial begeared passage of 167, there is no suggestion here of anything as specific as a mode of consciousness that has its objects in view only in so far as they can be seen as conducive or obstructive to its purposes. 34. And he says that my reading takes the notion of desire too literally. My response is of course that there is no question of a more or less literal understanding, that by using the word desire, Hegel simply means to introduce the topic of desire as a continuation of his discussion of consciousness, and goes on in that register, discussing life as the object of desire, the conflict between desiring beings, and ultimately the impossibility of understanding a subject's relation to itself and the world apart from that subject's relation to other subjects. 35 McDowell's argument against this reading is for the most part comprised of an alternate reading that he suggests is more plausible. But his reading also depends on a Hegelian reading of Kant's transcendental deduction, and we should start there, as he does at the beginning of his Lordship and Bondage article. Kant wants to argue that the categories are objectively valid, that there is synthetic a priori knowledge, by arguing that the categories, while subjective conditions for the possible thinkability of any possible object in experience, are also a condition under which every intuition must stand in order to become an object for me. B. 138. If he can show this, he can show that categorical order is not merely imposed on an intuited manifold. To show this adequately, which for McDowell, and Hegel and me, he only begins to do in the second edition deduction, he must forestall the objection that while one might argue that objects, considered as objects of thought, of judgment, must conform to categorical conditions for unity, it is quite conceivable that the conditions of their simple givenness to sensibility might not be those categorical conditions of unity. McDowell thinks Kant goes off track here by setting out to prove something like this desideratum, but not this, in trying to prove that for our intuitional conditions, space and time as subjective forms, this possible contrast could not take place, there could not be objects given under such subjective conditions discordant with what the understanding requires. This appeal to our subjective forms then for McDowell subjectifies or idealizes the result and proves the results true only of phenomena, given these quasi-factual, peculiar to humans forms of sensibility. McDowell, and Hegel and I, want to eliminate this sort of species-specific restriction. How might one do that? One might just directly analyze or separate out criteria, the absence of which would permit no distinction between what appears to be the case and what is, thereby rendering experience of a determinate object impossible. One criterion might be the differentiability between the successive perceptions of parts of something that in fact exist all simultaneously. We could be said to find that such a distinction is necessary and then show that our categorical conditions allow us to make it, and thus have demonstrated the right equipoise as McDowell calls it, between objective and subjective. As he puts it, to hold that the very idea of objectivity can be understood only as part of such a subjective structure is not to abandon the independently real in favor of projections from subjectivity. 36. If at this point someone were still to complain that we were still proving only that we need this distinction, not that objects must exhibit it, we could respond somewhat in the way Hegel does in his introduction. This is on the verge of asking that we consider what the world is, but apart from any way we have of knowing it. Without the distinction in question, the notion of an object in experience is incoherent, full stop. This is the background of what McDowell calls his heterodox reading of the self-consciousness chapter of the PHG. And a good deal of what he says fits many passages. It often can seem as if one were considering a single subject as an object of analysis, as if struggling to formulate properly the right equipoise or balance between the free exercises of apperceptive intelligence and that same subject's empirical dependence and receptivity. Such a dependence could first be conceived as some other to such a self-consciousness, constraining it exogenously, even through the subject's own sensibility. But then consciousness could be said to realize that such a putative other was, as Hegel puts it, itself another self-consciousness, not a passive or merely receptive other, that such a sensible dimension was an aspect of its own self-conscious relation to the world. This would all be presented as if a kind of theatrical Hegelian acting out of Kant's famous footnote at B 160 and 37 where he apparently blurs his own intuition understanding duality. In a similar but more dramatic and figurative way, Hegel could be said to begin to break down the strict opposition between the conditions of an apperceptive understanding and a distinct, separable form of sensible intuition. In his own inimitable way, he could be said to be doing this by portraying that struggle as at first a negation and disowning and refusal so extreme as to be a kind of attempt to kill off its own life, the struggle to death for recognition, then by subjugating it, the relation of lord and bondsman, then by a slow and gradual realization of its identity, as self-conscious subject, with what it has attempted to negate and dominate. 38. Further, it is certainly true, as McDowell says, that there remains a deep structural issue at stake, remains, that is, from the first 3 chapters. Hegel is continuing to try to show why the negation of the object's otherness cannot be simple annihilation, or in our Kantian language subjective imposition, whether the object is an external or an internal object. Such an other must be aufgehoben, preserved as well as negated, but again McDowell interprets all of this as an intrapsychic issue, where the latter issue remains self-consciousness's proper relation to itself, and especially to the deliverances of its own sensible faculties. This all correctly isolates what McDowell calls the structure at issue in the discussion, but I think it unnecessarily formalizes and so dilutes what Hegel is talking about, such that desire, life, and negation get purchase in McDowell's account only as exemplifications of structure, although, again, to be sure, he is certainly right that they are also that. As far as I can see, on McDowell's reading, Hegel is extending and developing with several figures, exemplifications, and illustrations, and even allegories, the desiderata we now know we need at the conclusion of the first 3 chapters. In its own terms, this advances Hegel's argument as it further clarifies, even dramatizes, what is required in any such potential equipoise, but I have already tried to indicate why I think the issue cannot be isolated as a drama going on within one consciousness. That is, even in the interpretation of the intrapsychic issue McDowell is considering, I think that Hegel has already set things up so that self-consciousness cannot, let us say, find itself, or its unity or its equipoise with the deliverances of its sensibility, inside itself. The self-relation in relation to an object that has emerged as a topic from the first 3 chapters is not a relation to an object of any kind, and so involves no grasp of anything. The subject of the world is not, that is, any kind of object in the world. When Hegel had declared that in the understanding's relation of objects the understanding discovers only itself, it would distort his understanding of what has been achieved to import the model of consciousness in any sense, whatever equipoise is suggested between subject and object in consciousness. According to Hegel, such a self-regard is always transparent and a projection outward, and therein lies the essential negative or going beyond itself moment in Hegel's account. In reporting what I think, even to myself, I am not reporting anything about me, but what I take to be true. In being aware of what I desire, of a desirous me, I am not reporting an effective state but thereby avowing a possible project of action in the world. 39 And it is in the world that the natural cycle of desire or need and satisfaction will be, later in the account, interrupted in a way of decisive importance for the rest of the PhD. I want to talk about such sociality in the next chapter, but to anticipate, McDowell complains that when Hegel makes his well-known claim in 175 that self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness, he cannot mean to begin describing an encounter with another person because that would leave the original puzzlement still a puzzle. That problem was, in Hegel's, the otherness of the sensible world and how to overcome it, in the simple sense know it, but without turning it into an idea. All that seems bypassed, he thinks, if we treat another self-consciousness as a second person. What has happened to the whole expanse of the sensible world, 40 McDowell asks. He therefore concludes that another self-consciousness in self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness, must still be referring to a singular self-consciousness, now aware of itself as self-conscious, and in that sense other to itself. 41. But Hegel has always been clear that he is interested throughout in a self-relation in relation to objects. That problem has not disappeared. It is in the background everywhere and has been reformulated in terms of the objects of desire for a living, desiring self-conscious consciousness. And Hegel specifically alerts us that we should not think of the whole expanse of the sensible world, although still there, in the same way as before. What self-consciousness distinguishes from itself as existing also has in it, insofar as it is posited as existing, not merely the modes of sense certainty and perception. It is being which is reflected into itself, and the object of immediate desire is something living. 168, My emphasis. This seems clearly to say that the new object of consciousness will be itself, as discovered in the understanding chapter, but not as observed object, rather as life. So its relation to the world will be as a self-related living being to objects for life. And there is no reason to think that his early formulation will remain Hegel's last word. The problem of the status of the sensible world in consciousness's self-relation in relation to an object will recur again, formulated at a higher level, in the discussion of observing reason, in the first half of chapter 5 of the Ph.G. In this chapter, having shown phenomenologically the necessity of an account of such a self-relation, Hegel is concentrating mainly on that. He has not forgotten the sensory world. Point 42. Finally and briefly, McDowell takes on the toughest passage for his reading, 177, where Hegel says that in this chapter the concept Begriff of spirit is already present for us, that a self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness. I note that Hegel says ein Selbstbewusstsein exists for ein Selbstbewusstsein, although McDowell could claim that our putatively disunified subject is so disunified at this point that its other self can appear to it as another self, in a kind of epistemic schizophrenia. Point 43. In a famous phrase, Hegel here signals the arrival on the phenomenological scene of an I that is a we and a we that is an I. McDowell says two things about this. One is that in this remark about spirit being present for us, Hegel makes clear that by spirit he merely means, at this point, an object that is just as much I as object, that we have left behind an objectifying notion of a self or subject. Another is that Hegel could be read as just previewing coming attractions, noting the full phenomenology of Geist's experience of itself will come later. Point 44. It is true that Hegel stresses here that the self of self-consciousness is not an object, but first, Hegel in the full quotation says, because a self-consciousness is the object of a self-consciousness, the object is just as much an I as it is an object. In the context of the passage, it does not seem possible to me to read this, 177, as saying that self-consciousness has itself as an object of reflection, that no reference to another self-consciousness need be meant. Note again the use of ein Selbstbewusstsein, not just Selbstbewusstsein or das Selbstbewusstsein. That might be a possible reading if one frames the issue exclusively in terms of the preceding paragraph, 176. But a transition has already occurred in the text by this point. In 175 Hegel has already argued that the model of mind and world, let us say, or subject and object in his terminology, obscures rather than helps reveal the nature of the self-consciousness essential to consciousness. On this model, desire is a manifestation of a natural process, and no true orectic intentionality has been achieved. Self-consciousness is thus unable by way of its negative relation to the object to sublate it, and for that reason it once again to an even greater degree re-engenders the object as well as the desire. 175. This claim serves as the premise of his inference to a radically new object. On account of the self-sufficiency of the object, it thus can only achieve satisfaction if this object itself effects the negation in it the object, and the object must in itself effect this negation of itself, for it is in itself the negative, and it must be for the other what it is. Since the object is the negation in itself and at the same time is therein self-sufficient, it is consciousness. My emphasis. This seems clearly to say that this negation must be reflected back to self-consciousness in order to be successful or satisfying, that one's claim for example should not just produce submissive assent, but be acknowledged as authoritative. An object, or self-consciousness itself on its own, or within itself, cannot accomplish this, cannot achieve the unity that must become essential to it. Hence the famous conclusion, self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. Further, McDowell offers no explanation of why Hegel would gloss that claim, the object is just as much an I as it is an object, by saying that spirit, Geist, which certainly does mean some sort of communal conception of subjectivity, should be a gloss on that passage. Point 45. Such a communal Geist, moreover, is not just said to be something to be discussed later. It is vorhanden, here now. How could he say that on McDowell's interpretation? Actually, 177 is not the most difficult passage for McDowell's interpretation. That honor goes to 182. In this way, this movement of self-consciousness in its relation to another self-consciousness has been represented as the activity of one self-consciousness, but this activity on the part of one self-consciousness has itself the twofold significance of being equally its own activity as well as the other's activity, for the other is likewise self-sufficient. Each sees the other do the same as what he himself does, each himself does what he demands of the other, and for that reason also does what he does only insofar as the other does the same. A one-sided activity would be useless because what is supposed to happen can only be brought about by way of both of them bringing it about. 182. I suppose it is possible to continue to claim that Hegel is still here talking about two aspects of a single self-consciousness, whether apperceptive and empirical I, or a subject discovering itself as not object but subject, and that language like each sees the other do the same as what he himself does remains allegorical, but I think there is much more textual and systematic evidence to support a non-allegorical reading than the evidence McDowell cites. V. So where does all this leave us? In general, we have a picture of a self or subject of experience and action estranged from, or divided within itself, without, as Hegel put it, a unity that must become essential to it, but conceived now in a way very different from Plato's divided soul, divided among distinct parts in competition for rule of the soul as a whole, and in a way very different both from other forms of metaphysical dualism, and from what would become familiar as the Freudian mind, split between the conscious and the distinct unconscious mind, or most explicitly for Hegel, and for Schiller, in distinction from the Kantian conception of noumenal and phenomenal selves. In a way somewhat similar to, and in an unacknowledged way in debt to Rousseau, Hegel treats this division as a result, not in any factual historical sense but as a disruption of natural orectic unity that must always already have resulted, and can only be rightly understood as effected. This division functions in Hegel as it does in some others as the source of the incessant desire not for rule or successful repression but for the wholeness, so often the subject of broader philosophical reflections on human life. Hegel does not accept the Platonic or Cartesian or Kantian account of a fixed dualism and so entertains this aspiration for a genuine reconciliation of sorts within such divisions. This is so in Hegel because he does not treat this division as a matter of metaphysical fact. The problem of unity emerges not because of any discovery of a matter-of-fact divided soul, but in the light of the realization that what counts as an aspect of my agency and what an impediment to it or what is a constraint on freedom, is a different issue under different conditions. In this light, under the conditions Hegel entertains in this chapter, the natural cycle of desire and satisfaction is interrupted in a way for which there is not an immediate or natural solution, and one's status as subject, judge, agent, is now said to emerge, in varying degrees, imagined under a variety of those possible conditions, as a result of this putative unavoidable conflict. The premise for this account is the one we saw much earlier. Hegel's way of putting it was that consciousness must always be thought to be beyond itself, more expansively put, that we have to understand a human self-relation as always also a projection outward as much as a turn inward. Once we understand such a self-relation as a normative self-determination, such a self is opens itself to, counterclaim, contestation, refusal, a different form of negation that forces a different sort of response, what Hegel will describe as initially a struggle for recognition. This is a lot to get by reflection on Kant's central idea, that the I think must be able to accompany all my representations, but that is, I have argued, Hegel's source. It is this reflection on Kantian spontaneity, understood by Hegel as also a self-dividing or self-alienating, that grounds the hope for an effected or resultant form of reconciliation of self with other, and thereby self with self. This way of looking at things is the source of his most beautiful image for this aspect of his project, an image that, typically, resonates both with Christian and pagan undertones. Later in the Phg. 669, he describes human existence itself as a wound, Wunde, but one which, he says, has been self-inflicted and which, one infers, which therefore, can be healed, even without scars, ohne Narben. Such a healing requires the resolution of the social dialectic that he introduces in the next phase of the argument of Chapter 4, and that will be our subject in the next chapter. Chapter 2. On Hegel's claim that self-consciousness finds its satisfaction only in another. Self-consciousness. You all at this moment know what you are doing reading a book about Hegel, let us say, and, as Elisabeth Anscombe among others made famous, you know it not by observation, the way you would know that someone else is reading something, nor by inference from observation. You know it just by engaging in such activity and sustaining that activity. Likewise, you know what you believe I mean to be saying without inspecting some mental inventory of your beliefs or any other mental items. You know it by knowing what you take me to be saying. Likewise, knowing what you are now doing would make no sense to you, would not be knowledge, unless the activity also seemed explicable. Knowing what you are about involves knowing why you are about it, and so involves what you take to be the reasons you are doing it. Likewise, knowing what you believe involves knowing why you take something to be true, what you take to be reasons for believing it. No one, that is, just believes something or just does something. What do these simple observations tell us about self-consciousness? I have argued that Hegel means to say something very similar and that, for Hegel, the claims make clear that self-consciousness is not the awareness of an object, at least not any observed object, and that it is a dynamic process, a doing in a way and a thinking in a way, not any momentary, second-order awareness. Somewhat surprisingly, he called that whole process desire, and I suggested in the last chapter that this was because, looking at things this way, such a way of knowing oneself in knowing or doing anything, not being momentary or punctuated in time, must involve some projection over time, a way of constantly and implicitly being attentive to, or at least open to the possibility of, whether one had it right, either about what one believed to be true, or about what one was doing, or whether one had the reasons one took oneself to have. This is, I think, the most important Aperçu in what we call German idealism, and it receives its fullest expression in Hegel's thought. The formulation just used was closer to the way Fichte would put the point in his discussion, not of begeerd or desire but of streben or striving. I can put the same point another way, and at a very high altitude, by noting something unusual about Kant. In what is known as the first introduction to his last critique, Critique of Judgment, Kant presented a very ambitious summary of his understanding of the basic human capacities involved in our knowing, doing, or feeling anything. He divided these capacities into three components, listing first what he called the basic faculties of the mind, and then to each basic faculty, he assigned what he called a higher cognitive faculty, something like the higher expression of such a faculty. So, to the basic cognitive faculty, he assigned understanding as the higher faculty, to the basic capacity to feel pleasure and pain he assigned as its higher counterpart the faculty of judgment, as in aesthetic pleasure and aesthetic judgment. And then, in a move somewhat at odds with the standard picture of Kant's philosophy, he listed as our third basic capacity desire, Begehrensvermögen, and assigned to it as the expression of its higher cognitive faculty, reason 1. Why would he make such a connection? I want to say that it is because for Kant reason is not a mere calculative faculty, as if a tool to be applied in the realization of ends. Rather, in the simplest sense, to be a creature with rational responsiveness is to be a creature that expects, demands, wants, struggles for justification, warrant, a righteousness both intellectual and moral, or, put another way, it is to feel a lack when such a justification is lacking. In his most familiar formulation of the point, to be a creature of reason is to be unable to rest content with knowledge of the mere conditioned, but to seek to ascend always to knowledge of the unconditioned. Kant noted that even the demonstration by his critical philosophy that such knowledge was impossible would have no effect on such yearning and the continuation of such quests, to reason, he put it in another context, must be said to have its own interests, its own teleological structure clearly evident when we act and know that we are acting in one way rather than another, inspiring in all such cases the need for justification, especially to others, for Kant, to all others. It was this structure that would provide the basis for Kantian morality. One could put the point in the Hegelian terms framed in the first chapter: to be such a reason-responsive creature is to be self-related in this erotic way in relation to all objects to be known and actions to be carried out, to be, as Hegel said in his peculiar way, beyond oneself. And what else is the sort of self-relation, so described as striving, inability to rest content, all in a uniquely reason-sensitive way but desire? The philosophical trajectory in German idealism that I am attempting to trace out and follow in these chapters is inspired by the spirit of Kant's classification, but it is difficult to explain in detail, and when explained at all becomes immediately highly controversial. The summary of Hegel's claim would simply be that the phenomenon at the heart of this philosophical movement, self-consciousness, must be understood as a practical phenomenon in somewhat the same way that Kant's classification already indicates his own formulation of the priority of practical over theoretical reason. As we have seen, in Hegel this means that, given the proper understanding of what a self is, any self-relating, self-ascription, or self-avowal cannot be understood by treating a self-relation as a relation to any sort of object, or by treating the relation as any sort of two-place intentional or introspectively observational relation. Instead, any such self-relation must be understood as something provisional and has to involve something to be achieved. The key historical figure in this post-Kantian development is Fichte, who understood the force of this point and its many implications better than almost anyone else. Point 3. But in the case of Hegel, the controversy and difficulty begin when we try to read his presentation of this point in his 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit in a way that fits into the flow of that text as a whole, and that means in a way that can explain how the discussion of self-consciousness as desire, or in the topic for this chapter, the discussion of self-conscious satisfaction in another self-consciousness is, as it appears to be, a continuous development of the first three chapters, and that means a continuation of the discussion of varieties of putatively direct mind-world relations. 2. My suggestion throughout has been that we take our bearings again from Kant, who began this trajectory by arguing that any possible objective purport in experience, any intentional determinacy, the possibility that thought could be of objects at all, has to be understood as a relation that must be actively established, cannot be understood as a result only of sensory interchange with the world, as if the mere presence of sensible objects and their modification of sensibility on its own, as it were, sets or triggers the content of conscious thought. This is what Kant meant by claiming that all contentful consciousness is apperceptive, a self-relation in relation to objects. In the broadest sense, this simply means that perceptual knowledge of something like a book on the table involves in some way not easy to spell out my taking there to be a book on the table, and not just my coming to be in a book-perceiving state. Wilfrid Sellars, in his classic essay, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, made this point by saying that perception is, so to speak, making an assertion or claim, for it is not easy to spell this out because the character of the conceptual activity at work is difficult to describe. As noted before, it certainly does not mean that experience actually consists of some string of impossibly many explicit judgments. But the key point is that any conscious attentiveness to content of a sort cannot be said merely to happen to a subject in any subject's experience, but must be a taking, an exercise of what Kant called spontaneity, even if not an exercise attended to as such. This point, that it must be such an active taking, is what Kant means by saying that consciousness is itself apperceptive. At any point when there is some need to do so, a challenge or an anomaly, any such taking can always be made into a judgment, it is always available for such an explicit claim. That is, in all my conscious attentiveness to the world there is some kind of self-relating going on, an implicit attention to the normative dimensions of all experience, an openness we might say everywhere and always to whether I am getting it right, an openness that must be held open, all as a characteristic of my attentiveness. It is this feature of that attentiveness that for Kant and his successors forever makes a wholly psychologistic or naturalistic account of consciousness incomplete. In the last chapter I tried to show how Hegel argued that properly understanding this point required us to think of such self-consciousness as always in a way provisional, as opening up a kind of gap between a subject's initial resolving and any satisfaction of its desire to confirm that what it takes to be true or right or good is, that this possible unity of itself with itself, as he said, must become essential for it, and so that self-conscious consciousness should be understood as desire. I took that claim to mean that the self-relation in question has got to involve the subject in some attempt, an attempt at what Hegel called a unity with itself, because any such initial relation established is always provisional in the sense of revocable. Consciousness is always beyond itself in his terms. Some putative content might, for example, not be coherently integrable with another. In Hegel's own terms, he also expressed this point by noting that self-consciousness was what he called a movement, Bewegung, 5.1, that contains stages of development for both an individual's and a culture's coming to self-consciousness, and that could be said to have an inherent teleological structure. Now once we have introduced in this way the idea that self-consciousness is something to be achieved, we can introduce a discussion of the conditions of its successful, or satisfying, realization, its self-certification in a way. And here Hegel's claim is just as bold and unusual as his original claim about desire. It is that self-consciousness finds its satisfaction the appropriate success word if self-consciousness is desire in another self-consciousness, or, going further, that a self-consciousness can actually be self-conscious only in being recognized. This is the basis of what will be the most important result in this way of addressing the matter, that our answerability to the world is inextricably bound with, even dependent for its possibility on, our answerability to each other. 6. 3. This is not the way the section is usually interpreted. Let me briefly present the more conventional view of what Hegel is after in this depiction of a primal struggle to the death for recognition, leading to the establishment of unequal and oppressive social relations based on power and violence. Hegel appears to be trying to make a contribution to a discussion that we recognize as a central one in all modern political and social thought. If we imagine the human condition prior to institutions and law, we might be able to imagine the nature of the resulting creation of institutional order and law and our stake in, and so the basic rationale for, such norms. We can see why such institutions are unavoidable and would have to be willed by any rational agent. So we imagine a kind of mythic picture of a form of life without established social bonds, and we get Rousseau's non-social solitary savage, Hobbes's terrified egoist, Locke's prudent, laboring individual, Rawls's veiled contractor, and here with Hegel we imagine a putative situation without any normative constraints on action. Hegel then seems to be suggesting that the primordial human problem is one that can be described in these 5 steps. 1. The original situation is a simple problem of independence and dependence. One is either able to execute one's will, despite the opposition of others, or one's will is controlled, blocked, or otherwise determined by another. There is no middle ground, no reason, on the radical hypothesis being entertained, to believe that anything can be assumed, any common value or basis for trust, to moderate or resolve this problem. We need not decide whether such independence is of value for itself or just as a means to security, stability, and the preservation of life. So Hegel's initial orientation is closest to Hobbes's picture, but he denies that there is any reason to think that everyone will see the advantages of a Leviathan state, rather than continued struggle. He argues that the willingness of any one party to insist on independence not as part of a strategy, but just in itself, even at the risk or cost of life, renders question-begging Hobbes' solution. Hobbes recognizes this possibility. Of course he worries about the persistence of vainglory but comes close to writing it off as insane. For Hegel this assumption simply builds into the Hobbesian picture of reason what Hobbes wants to get out of it. This is therefore a situation of unavoidable conflict, Kampf, struggle. It is, that is, on the simple assumption of finitude, that one's deeds will eventually conflict with or impede what another would otherwise have been able to do. And by hypothesis, we have no grounds for assuming any appeal to common interests or mutual advantage. The initial condition is imagined as too treacherous and unstable. 3. The struggle that ensues can end either with the death of both or the death of one. If the latter, the situation of uncertainty and challenge is not resolved, just postponed until another opponent shows up. 4. We have to be able to imagine a situation in which one refuses to submit, risks life, and the other submits, and this as something like the ground situation of all human social existence. The one who submits is not merely conquered, physically suppressed, but restrains himself in acknowledgement of the master. Like Freud, in Hegel drives of various sorts can be said to become human desire only when repressed, and in Hegel this will mean repressed in the face of a challenge by another. And again, this is all under the assumption that the original human problem, the one that civilized order is a response to, is one of mastery and submission and who will occupy what position. 5. But the problem of the master's independence is not resolved if the situation is something like a truce. The bondsman must truly submit and acknowledge the master's entitlement. But this acknowledgement is worthless to the master because he is recognized by one whom he does not recognize, and because the acknowledgement is coerced, cannot be assumed to be genuine submission, and so is dangerously more like a temporary truce than a victory. The bondsman, by submitting, has for the master been reduced to the level of animal life, and so the master's resolve to realize the mastery that he claims is thwarted. The bondsman, by contrast, does not negate his attachment to life in the abstract, aristocratic way of the master. Instead, he begins the long, slow process of liberating himself gradually from nature, through labor, science, technology, and so forth, and eventually the utter dependence, and uselessness, of the master are obvious for all to see, and human beings can begin to entertain the hope of a genuine mutuality of recognition, equality before the law, liberal democratic institutions, equal rights protection, and so forth. There is a great deal about this account that is true, and we shall return to elements of it. It involves the rather extraordinary claim that the unjustified exercise of mere power itself creates a form of dissatisfaction and suffering visited on those exercising such power, and in a way that makes it plausible to assume that such positions of domination and submission cannot long stand. But it is implausible that at this stage of the phenomenology, Hegel would simply begin suddenly talking about social struggle and the achievement of mutuality of recognition like this, as if beginning the book again on a new topic. Our task, the task of any dedicated reader, is still to see how the rudiments of this account of the nature of our answerability to each other are relevant to, inextricable from, our answerability to the world, or our answerability to reason, as one could put it, and that requires an approach that continues the interpretation that extends from the Kantian framework noted above. 4. The idea is that all determinate consciousness is, let us say, positional. 7 is something like having a position on what is its intentional object, or on what it is doing. It is to be understood as a taking, and it can only be positional, have a position, if this involves taking a position actively, or apperceptively. But this latter self-knowledge as an activity is not positional. It is not because its apperceptive self-awareness is not of an object, but rather is something like the avowing of a practical commitment of a sort, something like a projecting, if we stay with the project language, of oneself outward into the world and the future, all in the same sense that knowing what I am doing is not observational or introspective. If I have such knowledge, it is to be knowingly carrying on in the appropriate way. So what it is for me to be aware of my giving a lecture as I am giving it is for me to be continuously, now and into the future, actively if quite implicitly subscribing to, sustaining a commitment to, the norms of appropriateness for such an activity, something that certainly doesn't happen automatically, and can be disputed by others. 8 The stretching along or projecting or commitment sustaining from the present into all appropriate contexts and futures is what I argued Hegel calls desire. In its distinctly human form, and its satisfaction. 9 As we saw, Hegel's language for this is that the unity of consciousness must become essential for the subject, and he tells us that this means that self-consciousness is desire itself. To some degree this means that no self-conscious consciousness can take up one position and no other. What it is to have one position is to be committed to the various inferences and exclusions and further commitments in the future in other situations that position or commitment would entail, many obviously not evident at the time of assertion, but which introduce the problem of self-unity and so the desiring dimension of carrying on in a way that realizes the commitments I have undertaken. Now having a desire, even at the level of animal life, and responding to it in a way differentially geared to probable success, and altering what one does in the light of merely minimal success or failure is certainly a form of an intentional relation to the world. One could say, the world is for one in a way, and this is because one takes the world to be in various ways. One discriminates between food and non-food, potential mate or not and so forth. But in this sort of a picture one is simply subject to one's desire and subject to the fixed requirements of one's species life, subject to what Hegel starts referring to as life itself. A consideration of the animal's life as a whole, even its form of life, is necessary for any of its orectic states to make sense as the state it is, but it is not necessary for the animal. The animal's desires and their pursuit are not experienced in the light of such a whole and the place and relative importance of such pursuits within it. It is another thing altogether to be considered the subject of a life, actually to lead a life. Such a status would involve such a life being for the subject in some way, and would thus mean being the subject of commitments of one sort or another, to take the world to be in a way that counts as a claim and that comes with the assumptions of entitlement and the prohibitions of inconsistency, within such a whole. The Hegelian claim at issue now is that what one needs to add to the picture of a differentially responsive desiring being with a mere sentiment of itself, of its life, in order to differentiate such mere systematic responsiveness from action on the basis of claims, commitments, entitlements, justifications, warrants, is the presence of another subject capable of challenging such a potential claimant. Only in the presence of such a challenge, goes the argument, does the subject's self-relation become normative, not a natural expression of animal desire. Why would he formulate the issue this way? Before proceeding, though, a qualification is needed on the notion of adding something like this. I mean, what has to be in our picture of such an orectic being for it to be a recognizably human desirer? The idea is not that we and animals share a level of sentient responsiveness, and then we have another mental capacity somehow added onto such a shared sentient responsiveness. That would encourage a picture of self-consciousness as a self-monitoring of such sentient states, and that, as we have seen, would not be a picture of self-consciousness but simply of another level of consciousness. Our sentient responsiveness is itself self-conscious, the latter is not added on. Or, said another way, animals do not lack self-consciousness, are not like us, but without self-consciousness. They lack self-consciousness only in the trivial and uninformative and potentially endless sense in which I lack invisibility, or omnipotence. They have animal sentience, we have another form because self-conscious, but we can add what is different, other, about such self-conscious sentience, and that is the question pursued here, not an add-on question. The answer can be formulated in the neo-pragmatic language made well known recently by Robert Brandom, and I want to take up a bit of his interpretation of this chapter as a way of exploring what Hegel might mean. The first Hegelian point that Brandom captures extremely well in his own terminology is that self-consciousness has a distinct characteristic: how I take myself to be is self-constituting. I am who I take myself to be, or can only be said to be an I or subject insofar as I determinately take myself to be such and such, in some determinate way or other, and I accordingly functionally vary as such self-constituted takings vary. In his philosophy of subjective spirit in the Encyclopedia, Hegel writes, "Spirit is essentially only what it knows of itself, since such a self-relation is realized in deeds, fulfillments of projected commitments, I can also turn out not to be whom I took myself to be, or can turn out not to know what I took myself to know, but that erroneous self-conception is still an essential dimension of who I am. I might be a fraud, for example, or self-deceived, and therein lies something crucial to myself." 11. So, as Brandom puts it, summing up one of the most momentous and influential claims of the phenomenology, self-conscious beings do not have natures, they have histories. Human beings have taken themselves to be Christians, athletes, opera singers, spies, kings, professors, knights, and so on. They only are such if they take themselves to be, and their taking themselves to be at least partially constitutes their being such. 12. And that is indeed Hegel's deepest point here and is stressed throughout many formulations. Geist, he says, is a product of itself, historically self-made over time. 13. What I want to say is that Brandom, because he favors his own account, not Hegel's, of the relation between a causal perceptual interchange with the world and the role of sociality in the constitution of veridical claims, his reliable differential responsive disposition, RDRD, scorekeeping account, 14 reintroduces the two-step account of the intuition-understanding relation, a story that Kant and Hegel were trying to avoid, and so Brandom isolates the issue of the social nature of self consciousness in a way that is the mirror opposite of McDowell's account. Where McDowell's interpretation made Chapter 4 look like a reconsideration, even if also a deepening and so an extension, of the issue of consciousness and object, of apperceptive intelligence and sensible receptivity, Brandom's is a new topic interpretation of Chapter 4. While McDowell is certainly not trying to deny that sociality and social dependence will play crucial roles in Hegel's account later, he denies that such themes are relevant here, and so tries to preserve a common-sense picture in which successful perception does not involve such social dependence. 15. Brandom too distinctly isolates the sociality of self-consciousness. 16. I think that McDowell's isolation of the sociality theme occurs because he is generally suspicious of attributing any strong role, or at least what I would call a strong or robust role, to sociality in the conditions of perceptual knowledge itself. That all seems to him implausibly complicating and counter to a more common-sense position. And McDowell's position is overall more Kantian and concentrates only on the Hegelian account of the way conceptual activity shapes perceptual knowledge and intentional action. Brandom, on the other hand, concentrates on the issue of self-consciousness and sociality because he has his own quasi-Sellersian theory of perceptual content and the mind-world relation. What I am trying to argue is that neither gets right the relation between Chapter 4 and the first three chapters. The basic question at issue here is how to explain the necessary conditions for this self-constituting, and the terms of Hegel's answer are well laid out by Brandom. What would we have to add to the picture of an object's differential responsiveness to its environment, something that iron can do in responding to humid environments by rusting and to other environments by not rusting, from differential responses that are intentional, that are not simply caused responses to the world, but which can be said to involve taking the world to be a certain way. This is the proto-intentionality typical of animals who, when hungry, and so desirous, can practically classify, take the objects in their environment as food, desire satisfying. But differentially responding to food and distinguishing it from non-food does not satisfy hunger just ipso facto, as would be the case if we were still at the level of the iron responsiveness. Responding in that case is rusting. The animal must do something to satisfy its hunger and must do what is appropriate, sometimes involving several steps and even cooperation with other animals. It must get and eat such food. Another way of saying that the animal does not just respond to food items in its environment but takes things to be food is that there is now possible for the animal an appearance-reality distinction. It can take things to be food that are not and can learn from its mistakes. Or it only responds and acts to eat such food when it is hungry, when in a proto-intentional way, it takes the food as to be eaten. Now. 17. And thus far, I think this tracks very well what Hegel is up to. Having conceded that without sensory interchange with the world, there is no possible knowledge about the world, he goes on to argue that such a perceptual interchange alone, or the mere matter-of-fact modification of our sensibility, cannot amount to a world we could experience. We must understand how things are taken to be what they are by subjects, and that means understanding the kind of beings for whom things can appear, and so be taken, apperceptively, to be such and such, or not, indeed, take things to be such and such in the light of their possibly not being so, a normatively attentive being. And this means understanding the difference between mere differential responsiveness, and a desiring, discriminatory consciousness, a practical classification, or taking, which is the most basic, minimal way of understanding how things can be for a subject, and not just serve as response triggers. Noting this distinct capacity has gotten us to animal consciousness as proto-intentional. The next step is the crucial one. Now what do we have to add to this picture to get not proto-intentionality but real intentionality, that is, not just something like a sentiment of one's life in play as one seeks to satisfy desire actively, differentially, and in practically successful ways, but genuine self-consciousness and practical self-determination, acting on reasons one can produce. 18 What is it for a self to be for itself in all its engagements with the world and others, if it is not an introspectable object? One way to look at this, in line with what has been said, both in this section and before, is, we need to know what is necessary in order to introduce a distinction between what I take myself to be and what I am, or what I take myself to know and what I do know, or what I take myself to be doing and what I am doing, and we must do this without suggesting that one misapprehends oneself as an object, as if mistaking a dog for a wolf, or as if any direct confirmation of what one takes to be so is possible. Point 19 Rather, what is involved in so taking oneself is to attribute a certain determinate authoritative status to oneself, one that has to be provisional and subject to challenge. Point 20 That is, one can take hunger or the desire for food to be much more than an occasion or a stimulus to act, but to be a reason to act, or not. And assuming command, as it were, of such determinations is to take oneself to be, authoritatively, such a determiner, the decider, in the immortal words of our former president. The question is, under what conditions would this be what it is taken to be? Would so ascribing such authority to oneself be having such authority? That is, it is always theoretically possible to see any such resolution or self-ascription or self-assertion to be the expression of some other desire, perhaps a complex psychological animal desire for dominance or self-sufficiency or whatever. In such a case one would still be just subject to one's desires, and actions would just express such orectic attitudes, whereas what we want is a subject of desire, a subject determining which desire is to be pursued and why, for reasons. It is in answer to this question that Hegel introduces as a necessary element in, as I am putting it, this being what it is taken to be, and it is another self-ascribing subject whose position clashes with, renders impossible what would have been possible but for the presence of two such subjects and merely finite resources. This forces on a subject a question of commitment. Point 21 In a commitment, one is forced to resolve incompatibilities and sacrifice something, one is not just expressing a desire. To take oneself to be committed is to ascribe to oneself an authority that unavoidably involves an attitude toward an other. The most obvious is that in taking myself to be an authoritative taker I also establish a status that I have to concede is open to the other, if the same reasons for the commitment apply, and that I cannot deny to the other. It is in the presence of this sort of challenge that the implicit authority and status self-ascribed must be realized or not, will turn out to be indeed an actual such status and not another expression of the subject's subjection to the imperatives of life, or not. And that realization must involve the possibility of just such a claim to authority by another. Likewise, put a different way, such avowals could be in some psychological sense sincere but turn out to be inconsistent with what someone attributing to himself such an authority would have to say and do. In making this clear, Hegel introduces a dramatic illustration that has become very well known, a struggle to the death for recognition. This is the beginning of the suggestion we have touched on before, that Hegel considers the distinct normative status of human subjects, as persons, agents, not as a reflection of some substantive or metaphysical nature, but as a social achievement of a kind, and so as bound up with an inevitable and distinct form of social conflict. Here he begins by trying to make clear in a very simple way what it is to have achieved a kind of independence from the species-specific requirements of life, and he claims that such an achievement is only possible in relation to others, and that it is just that something we achieve. Human beings, Geist, make themselves into beings who ultimately hold themselves and others to account. They do not just interact and clash as the result of the contingent expressions of desire. We intuitively resist this picture and think that such a norm responsiveness must be explained by some metaphysical distinction between the kind of thing we are and the kind of things animals and inanimate beings are. But there is never any appeal to this sort of metaphysics in Hegel's account. Desire-triggered responses are experienced as commitments when in some context I am compelled to decide what is important, what is significant, what perhaps weighs against life itself. This is not the emergence of a metaphysical distinctiveness, but the start of a new game that, as far as we know, only human animals can play, a language game, or Geist game of holding each other to account by appealing to and demanding practical reasons, justifications for what emerge as claims of authority. What we want to know now is how such a game can be effectively played, the answer to which cannot be provided by attention to the biological properties of the beings or their evolutionary history. In Brandam's summation of the point we have reached, he says, "What is required to be able to take something to be a self is to be able to attribute attitudes that have distinctively normative significances, to move from a world of desires to a world of commitments, authority, and responsibility." Point 22. In the extreme conditions imagined by Hegel, attributing a normative significance to myself or acknowledging someone's entitlement to claim authority cannot be merely expressions of sentiment or preference if what is at stake and can be risked is all attachments to life, desire, and so forth. Point 23, the radical Hegelian claim, which need not be an issue here, is that all having such authority amounts to is being acknowledged under the right conditions and in the right way to have such authority. 24. And if that is so, then the relevant satisfaction or resolution of such an insistence cannot be just the submission or retreat of some other. The resolution must be a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition of the authority claimed in such a struggle. That is all that in this game would make authority authority. And so the desire inherent in all consciousness, consciousness being beyond itself, such that its unity with itself must become essential for it, it has turned out, must be, cannot but be, a desire for recognition by others. Point 25. Just as we saw in our discussion of Kant, one cannot be said to be a reason-responsive being without being a creature of desire, striving to close the gap between claim and justification, intention and successful realization, action and legitimation. Likewise in Hegel's transformation of that point, in ascribing a certain normative, authoritative status to oneself, one cannot be said to be indifferent not only to those who practically prevent the realization of such claims, but also to those who challenge and reject such status altogether, and who can claim alike and conflicting authority for themselves. How this all works is then spelled out by Brandam in ways quite close to his own account of the role of the social attribution of authoritative status as the required normativity essential to possible intentionality in general as well as essential to the possibility of self-consciousness. So specific recognition involves acknowledging another as having some authority concerning how things are, what things are. Ks. When I do that, I treat you as one of us, in a primitive normative sense of us, those of us subject to the same norms, the same authority that is instituted by just such attitudes. Point 26. However, there are various aspects of Brandam's account that do not match Hegel's in Chapter 4, and these divergences are related. His account is of course a reconstruction. 27. But for one thing, he leaves out an element that on the surface seems quite important to Hegel's sense of the case he is making. I mean his appeal to the experience of opposed self-consciousnesses. This concerns what Brandam has elsewhere called disparagingly the martial rhetoric of Chapter 4, especially the talk of a struggle to the death, which Brandam wants to treat as a metonymy, a figure of sorts for genuine commitment. Regarded this way, being willing to risk anything important could show that the commitment functioned as a norm, not the expression of mere desire, or animal desire, alone. But Hegel treats the extreme situation, the risk of life, as a key element in the story itself, not as an exemplification of a larger story, the making explicit of the logical nature of commitment. It illustrates the possibility of an independence from all dependence on life itself. I think that what Hegel tries to explain at this point is why it is that we cannot treat as satisfactory any picture of a monadically conceived self-conscious desiring consciousness, a desiring being who can practically classify and who is aware of being a practical classifier and so has a normative sense of properly and improperly classifying, but is imagined in no relation to another such self-conscious classifier or imagined to be indifferent to another's construals and claims, his takings. This is inadequate on the simple empirical premise that there are other such subjects around in a finite world, which subjects will not and from their point of view cannot allow such pure self-relatedness. Brandom is right that what distinguishes holding a commitment from merely expressing a desire is a willingness to alter or give up the commitment if it conflicts with others. One wouldn't be committed to anything if one knowingly accepted inconsistent commitments. And Hegel asks us to imagine how an inescapable conflict with others attempting to satisfy their desires forces on one the nature of one's attachment to life. It is in response to such conflict that the relation can now count as a commitment, given that one surrendered or sacrificed the original commitment for the sake of life. Life has become a value, not a species imperative. But the sketch we have so far of a self-conscious theoretical and practical intentionality ensures not only that there will be this contention, but that on the premises we have to work with so far, it has to be a profound contention that can, initially or minimally conceived, only be resolved by the death of one, or the complete subjection of one to the other. This will play a large role in Hegel's account of the sociality on which we are said by him to depend. V. Here are some examples of passages where Hegel makes such claims. The important remarks occur after 175. There Hegel contrasts the satisfaction of animal desire, whose subject, following Brandom, takes things a certain way, differentially discriminates, but then simply negates these objects, or satisfies its desire. Such a subject may be resisted in a sense by one's desired object fighting back, if we are talking about predator and prey. But such resistance is just not a challenge, more like an obstacle. No challenge to the correctness of the classifications or the entitlement to make them has been made. With this sort of negation of one's object, another desire arises. That is, desire and the certainty of itself achieved in its satisfaction are conditioned by the object, for the certainty exists by way of the act of sublating of this other. For this act of sublating even to be, there must be this other. 175. In this situation, to revert to the language we have used several times, one cannot be said to be the subject of one's desires but subject to one's desires. One's putative independence as the subject of one's thoughts and deeds is actually a form of dependence, and so one's takings cannot yet be counted as normative takings. That is, one is subject to the endless cycle of desire and satisfaction and cannot be said to have achieved any distance from one's desires, any independent point of view on them. Self-consciousness is thus unable by way of its negative relation to the object to sublate it, and for that reason it once again to an even greater degree re-engenders the object as well as the desire. This all changes however, when, among the objects of self-consciousness's orectic attitudes there is an object which is not an object but another potential subject, which, as such a subject, cannot simply be negated, only destroyed as an object, but if it is to satisfy the desire of the first subject, must in itself effect this negation of itself. He puts it less abstractly in 182, for that reason, it can do nothing on its own about that object if that object does not do in itself what the first self-consciousness does in it. Another subject, challenging rather than impeding my satisfaction of desire, and this by forcing the issue to the death, is inaccessible to me as such a subject, unreachable by direct force or coercion. Whatever relation is to be established must be affected by that subject, he must do in itself what the first self-consciousness does in it. 6. At this point we must remember all the way back to our discussion of 80 in the first chapter, and state these results in terms of the original problem. That passage included the claim that a self-conscious consciousness is always beyond itself and that the problem this engenders, the unity of self-consciousness with itself, must become essential to self-consciousness. One form of such satisfaction is simple desire satisfaction. Unity with self is produced by eliminating the gap or need within the self, the desire. This is though only a temporary satisfaction, there are always new and manifold desires stimulated, to which one is subject. But another sort of satisfaction altogether is at issue when one's claims or takings as such are confronted by another who denies them, who has his own claims, or when one's deeds, inevitably affecting what others would otherwise be able to do, are rejected, not merely obstructed, by a being whose deeds conflict with one's own. 28 The achievement of such a unity is not then possible alone. As Hegel will go on to show, one will not have responded to such challenges as the challenges they are, a resolution of unity of such disparity will not have become essential to it, by simply annihilating the other, and so one will not have satisfied oneself, or achieved the unity, self-satisfaction, spoken of so frequently. One would still be in the position of an animal desirer, endlessly subject to one's desires. The presence of another taker who takes himself to be a taker and so who is a potential challenge, not just an obstacle, establishes that the normative problem, whether one's takes on the world are as they ought to be, or are worth what one had assumed, is essential to the self-reconciliation. That means that this confrontation of affirmation and negation cannot be resolved on, let us say, the animal level. That is, self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. Or, only thereby does self-consciousness in fact exist, for it is only therein that the unity of itself in its otherness comes to be for it. 177. But in Hegel's account, there is no non-question begging criterion, or method, or procedure or standard by which such a contention can be resolved. Whatever one might count as the giving and asking for reasons might be counted by the other as the arbitrary expression of the other's desire for success, as a mere instrumental ploy or strategy. 29 So, Hegel reasons, the primitive expression of normative commitment, the only available realization, Verwirklichung, of the claim as a claim, is a risk of life itself. The exhibition of itself as the pure abstraction of self-consciousness consists in showing itself to be the pure negation of its objective mode, that is, in showing that it is fettered to no determinate existence, that it is not at all bound to the universal individuality of existence, that it is not shackled to life. 187. Hegel makes such a claim not because of any anthropological position about the centrality of honor in human life. He claims what he does because he is trying to assemble the central, minimal elements of genuinely human sociality among self-conscious beings, a sociality that can provide the satisfaction he has argued arises as a problem with the realization that consciousness is always beyond itself. And he is insisting that in this assembling, we must begin without begging any questions. So he proposes we think of the problem as a struggle within such narrow parameters, and we get this famous picture of everything being at stake. The relation of both self-consciousnesses is thus determined in such a way that it is through a life and death struggle that each proves his worth to himself, and that both prove their worth to each other. Das Sie sich selbst und einander durch den Kampf aufleben und Tod bewahren. 187, 30. Throughout the rest of the chapter, Hegel shows the practical incoherence of any attempted resolution of such conflict by the establishment of mere power, or coerced recognition. It is clear that what is ultimately necessary for such a conciliation, for beings conceived as Hegel now has, is some resort to practical reason and so ultimately some shared view of a universal reconciliation. 31 And Hegel has a pragmatic or a historicized or dialogical 32 view of what counts as the appeal to reasons that is consistent with this whole picture. He understands practical reason as a kind of interchange of attempts at justification among persons, each of whose actions affects what others would otherwise be able to do, and all this for a community at a time. What counts as instances of such attempts, that is, changes over time. But his account of what these attempts at mutual justification consist in requires in effect the rest of the book, the developmental and experiential procedure characteristic of a phenomenology. 7. Self-consciousness is desire itself. I have argued that Hegel means by this, once he has distinguished mere desire from human desire, that the apperceptive element in all thought and action is not self-regarding but self-positing, or something like, in both McDowell's and Brandam's terms, taking responsibility, claiming authority for, what one thinks and does. In Hegel's account it is possible to imagine a transition of sorts between a primitive, still naturally explicable version of such a taking to a full-fledged, self-conscious, authority-claiming status only in the presence and especially challenge of another such self-conscious being. This is the beginning of a socially mediated conception of intentionality as such. But at this early stage in his account, we are not entitled to assume any prior agreement about the rules of reason in resolving the struggle for recognition, rules for the acknowledgement of the genuine authority of one's claims that must inevitably arise as problematic under the premises of Hegel's account thus far. Accordingly, within the assumptions Hegel allows himself, such a confrontation can only be resolved in the crudest of terms, by a fight to the death. This establishes whose claims are in fact claims made by a subject rather than the expression of life's imperatives, because the struggle pushes the issue to the point where a complete indifference to life's imperatives determines the result. For each subject, this putative confrontation raises the question of whether one's existence as a living natural being is paramount, or whether one will ascribe to oneself the authority to determine the fate of one's existence as a subject of, not subject to, one's life. This relation to natural life and so the distinct status of a human subject is, as we have been saying throughout, something that must be achieved. The self-relation in relation to objects and others must be achieved, is a practical phenomenon inseparable from a relation with and initially an unavoidable struggle with, others. Genuinely human-mindedness, the soul, spirit, the variety of designations for the distinctly human, are all going to be read through the prism of this idea that such a distinction is fundamentally a result, what will eventually emerge as a historical achievement. Now Hegel is not of course suggesting that the resultant social statuses of lord, Herr, and bondsman, Knecht, represent a stable social achievement or resolution of the problem posed, just the opposite. He sets out immediately revealing its instability and unsatisfactory and so temporary status. Famously, the lord must remain unsatisfied because he is recognized by one whom he does not recognize as capable of acknowledging authority. He sees the bondsman as little more than an animal, attached to animal life. The lord does not appreciate, as the slave ultimately will, that the bondsman has in effect chosen life as a value, a choice that constitutes, ultimately, we might say, the modern or bourgeois form of life. And the bondsman recognizes someone who does not recognize him, so has not yet achieved the initial status of authoritative recognizer. But, Hegel explains, the bondsman is now in a position to understand that the stark opposition between attachment to or independence from life is a false opposition and can begin the slow work or labor of the concept in freeing himself from his natural dependence and thereby eventually from the master, who grows increasingly dependent on the bondsman. In this context, one can understand how and why Hegel thinks of human freedom as a historical and social achievement, not a metaphysical or any other sort of property of the human as such. And all of us are well aware of the extraordinarily powerful impact such a notion would have outside of philosophy in the 19th and 20th centuries. Concluding remarks. In 184, Hegel sums up what he takes himself to have shown to be the basic movement, as he calls it, of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness, that is never the direct presence of anything like a self-object to itself, it is a processual or dynamic self-relation that is to be achieved. Self-constituting self-construals, taking oneself to know something or taking oneself to be committed to doing something, are as mere avowals only provisional and are redeemable as such only in the future and with others. We have just seen why Hegel thinks that such a self-consciousness, construed this way, can only find its satisfaction, can only redeem those self-certainties in truth, in another self-consciousness. He now says that such a movement, so construed, must be about an attempt at recognition. To any putative pair of opposed self-consciousnesses must be ascribed an inherent practical teleology, the ultimate outcome of which is that they recognize themselves as mutually recognizing each other. 184. By inherent teleology he means to say that the attempted fulfillment of a desire, and the self-relation characteristic of desire, can be imagined to be experienced differently in a situation of conflict, especially ultimate conflict. One can be imagined to have to determine what is worth fighting for, why, what value life has and so forth. In this sense a practical teleology just means a discovered expansion of the in order to structure characteristic of action. One can be presumed to discover, in trying to satisfy one's desire under certain limited assumptions, that the assumptions must be changed and the formulation of the practical project itself must be reconceived. But this alteration also means that one's avowals of commitments, importance, significance, what is essential to oneself and so forth, now understood as claims against another, contending self-consciousness, are thereby also understood as expressed with some claim to authority. And as we have seen, they can only be asserted if they are asserted with some assumption of normative force, otherwise they would just be expressions of reactions to various internal pushes and pulls of desires, passions, fears, and so forth. I could not be said to be avowing a commitment if I am indifferent to denials of its realization, or indifferent to inconsistencies with other claims I avow. It is in this sense that consciousness itself is for Hegel essentially a rational phenomenon. In the presence of an imagined extreme challenge by another taker, the projected satisfaction of a desire now must count as a claim against the other's attempt. If that is so, then the assertion of such a claim is also the attribution to oneself of an authority to make it. But such a self-attribution would not be the attribution of authority unless one understood the difference between merely attributing the authority to oneself and actually having such authority. At the stage of mere conflicting claims of authority, Hegel suggests that only one sort of step, consistent with the limited premises of such an account, will settle such an issue, the submission by one party to another, acknowledging such an authority under such a threat, one that can only be understood at this point as motivated by, practically rationally justified by, an unwillingness to risk everything on the authority claim, an unwillingness to die. This assumption of a fight to the death, a raising of the stakes beyond what any attachment to life could explain, is meant then to short-circuit any interpretation that remains at the animal or natural, or desire-triggered level. And so, just in themselves, such avowals raise the question of their own success conditions, the relation between subjective self-certainty, and truth, in Hegel's frequent formulations. I can avow all sorts of entitlements to things, demand to be treated in a certain way, insist that the status I assert for myself should be the status I have in the world, and so forth. But avowing it doesn't make it so, and I cannot be indifferent to the relevant realization of what is demanded or claimed. And there is no indication that Hegel has lost sight here of the breadth of this issue. The authority of epistemic claims and commitments is also part of this story. This inherent condition, for putative claims to authority really being authoritative, is something Hegel now begins to treat as a matter of social acknowledgement. What it is for such a claim to authority or normative force or entitlement to have authority or so forth, is for it to be acknowledged as such by others. But as the quotation above indicates, this is not something resolved by mere matter-of-fact acceptance. Most of the subsequent narrative in the PHG is all about failed attempts at the establishment of the right recognitive relation, after the establishment of what had been taken to be satisfactory. That recognitive relation must satisfy certain conditions if the recognition is to do what the claimant to normative force requires. We learn what conditions by seeing what their absences mean for the experiencing consciousness. It must be mutual, or to say it more strongly and clearly, must satisfy the conditions of genuine mutuality. In the language Kojève uses, to assert and claim one's desire in the face of any such challenge, is already to desire something non-natural. It is to desire another's desire, a desire to be desired, the others relating to oneself as one relates to, avows commitments in the name of oneself. One cannot coerce this, merely trick the other into granting it, Jacob and Esau-like, or be indifferent to the issue without losing one's own hold on the claim as a claim to authority, one with genuine normative force. So the only condition in which the authority of oneself constituting self-construals can be true is the condition of genuine mutuality. Point 1. This means that those normative considerations that emerge from the imagined camp must be in some clear sense genuinely accepted by the other, something only the other can manage and which I cannot coerce, and vice versa with respect to the other's claims on me. They must be claims and considerations that can be shared, and this immediately sounds a final Kantian reverberation. For Kant had also made his own, non-phenomenological, case for the practical inescapability of the claims of reason in anything we do. I cannot be said to be acting at all, to be an agent, except insofar as I act on reasons, and Kant thought he could show that such reasons cannot be egoistic, but must be of the form that could be shared in order to count as reasons at all, that is, for me. So, I would suggest, the difference between Kant and Hegel does not concern this core issue, which they agree on. Kant famously thought at this point that such a shareability requirement, mutuality of recognitive status, in his language, universality, could be satisfied just in consideration of the form of the reason, or policy maxim I give myself. Adopt no maxim that could not at the same time serve as a universal law for all. Although he also seemed to think an equivalent formulation was, always act as a member of the kingdom of ends, act in such a way that you consider not just yourself but everyone as an autonomous rational setter of ends, and adopt no maxim inconsistent with the existence of such a kingdom, a formulation much closer to the Hegelian insistence on mutuality of recognitive status. Here Hegel veers sharply away from Kant on this issue of resolving what counts as the realization of true mutuality, universality, shareability of claims for normative authority. For he begins his account by pointing to such an ultimate ideal resolution, but by methodologically conceding, in effect, that we have no determinate idea ex ante, and can have no immediate intuitions about what such genuine mutuality consists in. As in so many other accounts, he proposes a developmental, not an analytic or deductive approach, in this case from a minimally normative but internally unsatisfying claim to such a basis for recognition, the master-bondsman relation, which the master and the bondsman take to be more than matter-of-fact power, but a rights relation, as it should be because of the master's victory, and then showing gradually the internal strains and incompatible commitments such a presumption gives rise to. Thus, perhaps with Kant's chief category in mind, he says, the individual who has not risked his life may admittedly be recognized as a person, but he has not achieved the truth of being recognized as a self-sufficient self-consciousness. 187. Hegel is here conceding that we can already say we have come to understand the formal character of mutuality, but he is also insisting that without some experiential, development account, one that begins with the centrality of conflict, to the death, and the reactive attempts to make sense of the results, we will never be able to resolve what such genuine mutuality amounts to. There are two important new developments in Chapter 4 that follow from this setup. The first is Hegel's account of the significance or meaning of the bondsman's work, when that work is considered as performed in abject servitude. The important point Hegel makes is that when viewed historically, and from quite a high altitude, the bondsman's work is inevitably educative, transformative. Work is said to be desire held in check, Gehemtbegehrt, 195, and thereby something that educates, bildet. The result is that the bondsman gradually begins to acquire a mind of his own, dies Wiederfinden seiner durch sich selbst einer Sinn. And this occurs with, in effect, everything at stake, life and death, because the bondsman always labors in submission to the true master and master, the fear of death. This existential fable is in effect Hegel's response to Rousseau's declensionist narrative in his second discourse, where the division of labor, and the beginning of the ever more complex and intricate forms of human dependence that it brings with it, is regarded as the beginning of a kind of social slavery. In Hegel's account, this dependence, like the fear of the master, is the beginning of wisdom, here a kind of practical wisdom, as it is the master who grows ever more dependent, to the point, finally, of utter uselessness, too, and it is the bondsman who starts to achieve the slow conquest of nature and so liberates himself from the natural attachments responsible for his servitude in the first place. Point 3. Second, Hegel suggests a way of understanding a difficulty that must emerge from his own account so far. The self-attribution of authority is like the having of a propositional attitude, a belief, say. As we have been discussing throughout, post-Kant and after his apperception thesis, the assumption is that one can only actually have a belief if one has the concept of belief, as in, one can come to have the belief that one's prior belief was wrong. Point 4. In this case, ascribing any authority to oneself requires some sense of what it is actually to have such authority, as opposed to merely affirming that one does. The normative relation between the master and the bondsman, however, involves an understanding of the basis of the authority exercised by the master that each also knows to be profoundly flawed. The bondsman submits to the master for the sake of his life, the master exercises his authority in the name of his indifference to mere life. But the slave's acknowledgement is worthless to the master, and the master withholds any real recognition of the bondsman. Each in a general sense takes back with one hand what is proffered by another, and must find a way of understanding their untenable and unstable situation. They must, because just as you cannot avow a commitment that is knowingly inconsistent with another commitment, you cannot attribute an authority which you also undermine or know cannot be based on what you take it to be based on. If the master has no real authority, there is no way truly to internalize and live out such a submission. And if the bondsman is not a possibly recognizing other, then the master's claim to authority is empty and unsecured. Hegel's unusual suggestion at this point begins quite a different way of understanding what normally would be taken to be various possible philosophical and religious options. Hegel understands them, Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness, as a way of, in effect, compensating for and evading the situation just described. Within thinking, I am free because I am not in an other, rather, I remain utterly in my own sphere, and the object, which to me is the essence, is in undivided unity my being for myself, and my moving about in concepts is a movement within myself. 197. And ever since it made its conscious appearance in the history of spirit, this freedom of self-consciousness has, as is well known, been called Stoicism. Its principle is this, that consciousness is the thinking essence and that something only has essentiality for consciousness, or is true and good for it, only insofar as consciousness conducts itself therein as a thinking creature. 198, translation modified. What was noted earlier as Hegel's unusual approach to such a position, I can be free even in chains as long as I remain a thinking essence, and so forth, is quite clear at the end of 199. As a universal form of the world spirit, it can only come on the scene in a time of universal fear and servitude, which is, however, also a time of universal cultural maturation which has raised culturally educative activity all the way up to the heights of thought. My emphasis. This kind of approach that we can only fully appreciate what is actually being claimed by Stoic philosophy, what the full content of the Stoic position consists in, by understanding it as a form of world spirit and as appropriate to a time of universal fear and servitude, is also applied to skepticism and the version of Christianity to which Hegel gives the dramatic name, the unhappy consciousness. In each case he also tries to develop internal deficiencies in the positions that are themselves reflections of the unsuccessful normative self-understandings of the relevant types. Stoicism results in a sweeping, abstract, and indeterminate, and so finally unsatisfying, appeal to mere thinking as such. Skepticism's universal and relentless negation of any claim and value finally becomes self-negating, The unhappy consciousness exists in a state of self-division and self-contradiction that cannot be coherently or practically maintained. In its growing self-awareness, such an unhappy consciousness ultimately will learn to seek its unity with itself, that elusive desideratum that has been with us since 80 of the introduction, not in a beyond but in all of reality as itself rational, by ultimately, as reason, being certain of being all reality, 230.5. But both this approach and the claims themselves are controversial enough for a lengthy separate discussion. Our interest throughout has been on Hegel's two extraordinary claims that self-consciousness is desire, and that self-consciousness finds its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness, and I hope that what has been said has justified such extensive attention to these dramatic formulations. 1. Against this whole approach, John McDowell has urged, toward a reading of Hegel on action in the Reason chapter of the Phenomenology, in HWV, that in making something like agency or authority dependent on actually being acknowledged as such, bad philosophy is being unnecessarily foisted onto Hegel. We can respect a constitutive connection between the status and a possibility of its being acknowledged, without needing to accept that it is conferred by acknowledgement that one has it by being taken to have it. 169. But there are two senses of possibility here. One involves the claim that one need not be actually and literally acknowledged by some real others in some continuous stretch of time in order to count as having the status. Possibly being so acknowledged is all one needs, but one maintains the view that one has such a status or authority thanks to the possible acknowledgement by others in one's community. The other sense implies that one simply has the status or authority, full stop, and it could possibly be acknowledged by others, because one actually has it, in itself, but they would then just be noting an independent normative fact. The latter is not a Hegelian thought, and the former is all I, or Hegel, need. Moreover, McDowell does not note that such authority is not simply, or as a matter of mere fact, conferred. As noted, most of what Hegel discusses are attempts to confer it that fail, and what is interesting about his account is how he works his way toward eventual success. 2. In the PHG, especially, 6.b.I, the world of self-alienated spirit. 3. This is what it all means for us. For consciousness, at such an initial stage, nothing is as clear as all this. Cf. Because not each and every one of the ways in which his natural consciousness was brought to fruition was shaken to the core, he is still attached in himself to determinate being. His having a mind of his own is then merely stubbornness, a freedom that remains bogged down within the bounds of servility. The form is a skill which, while it has dominance over some things, has dominance over neither the universal power nor the entire objective essence. 196. 4. Cf. the discussion of Davidson in footnote 6 of chapter 1. 5. This also means that we are back at an issue that bothers McDowell, who rightly asks, especially in his Owl of Minerva response, forthcoming, if the antithesis so problematic in the consciousness chapters had been between an independent, spontaneous intelligence, and a dependent, sensibility-bound receptivity, how is a discursus on interpersonal relations supposed to help resolve that antithesis? What I have tried to show is that Hegel demonstrates that the antithesis problem is revealed to be one about claim-making authority and the problematic status of any self-ascribed authority. This becomes the issue it is under challenge from another, and with the structure of that relation and struggle, and so the problem of universality, on the table, he can return to the question of such authority, in claims about the world, as, ultimately, a matter of the nature of our claims on one another.